I wanted to talk to you about a strange encounter I had years ago when I went turkey hunting down by the Mississippi River. I went with my brother, whom we grew up together, very close. A lot of brothers fight and end up being distant from one another. However, me and my brother grew up playing video games and enjoying the outdoors together. One of our favorite pastimes is to go fishing, so we got up early. This is probably about 4 or 5 in the morning if I recall correctly, and for whatever reason on this morning, we had forgot to bring any flashlights, so we were trying to track through the woods in the dark with all of our supplies. That's when we heard things that make this whole incident terrifying. Me and my brother are just a couple of feet away from each other, navigating our way when we begin to hear sounds like a stampede around us, going the opposite direction into the thick wilderness. I'm not kidding when I say stampede. It sounded like multiples of these big heavy animals trotting around us, maybe not even 20 feet away. When I tell people this, during this part of the story, they tell me it was probably a bunch of bucks. But I'm here to tell you I know what a quadruped animal sounds like. This wasn't it. I have heard deer run many times, and this did not sound like it. It didn't sound like hooves. And when I say run, I'm talking about people. It sounded like multiple big heavy people were running all around us in the opposite direction we were going. Multiple people. Maybe like 10. Very, very heavy footsteps. The noises that accompanied were equally terrifying. My brother and I were frozen still as this was going on, all the while hearing grunts and moans. Grunts that were very guttural. Reminded me of a lion's guttural growl almost. The whole thing had lasted 20 seconds, and then just like that, it was gone. I don't think we broke silence for maybe a minute or two after. My brother whispered, "What the hell was that?" I had no idea. I didn't even know what had just happened. We decided to screw the fishing trip right then and there and get back to the truck and go. The whole way back we were trying to make sense of what just happened and what kind of animal could even do that. We kept coming back to moose or bear or deer because it's the only thing that would or could make sense with how heavy this was, but we both agreed it didn't sound like something running on 4 legs. There's nothing in the woods that's heavy that runs on 2 legs. Very freaky to think about. And the growling? There's no animals we can pinpoint those noises to. This happened just last summer when I went horseback riding with a couple of friends. It was about 3 in the afternoon, and the sun was bright, and it was perfect weather outside. The horses we were riding were actually my friends. These were well behaved. They had a lot of human contact and were ridden a lot. In fact, I had ridden on these horses a couple of times before, but it had been at least a few months, so I was joyful to be back on such a peaceful, loving animal. My friend and his horses choose between 3 to 4 different trails that go along their property, all of them being several miles in length at one point or another loop around. My friend is lucky enough to have hundreds of acres that he had inherited through family and decided to use them for horseback riding and hunting. Beautiful, beautiful backcountry, I will say. We were riding along the trail, and we were in an area with thick forest on both sides of us, which is not too abnormal since most of the trail does have thick forest, but other parts of the trail were open and more rocky and mountainous. We were chatting amongst ourselves when suddenly my friend's horse directly in front of me starts freaking out. Not even 2 seconds later, both my horse and my other friend who owns the horses starts freaking out. The horses, they were acting skittish and out of control. We're trying to calm the horses down when we start hearing what sounds like trees being knocked over and smashed. This was so loud, and it wasn't far away from us. It just sounded like a massive bulldozer being driven through the woods, coming straight in our direction. But there was no machinery sound, nothing. Just the sound of something very large coming through and crashing through the woods. Whatever it was must have spooked the living hell out of our horses. I don't even think there was much communication other than just pure action and fight or flight. We all turned around in unison with our horses, trying to get them to go back the way we came. As we managed to get a hold of the horses enough to start going back in the direction, we came and I turned my head around behind me to see a large pair of canine-like ears poking through the forestry. As my brain scrambled to find an appropriate answer for what I'm seeing, I then noticed these glowing red eyes slightly lower than the ears, and realized we're being watched by something. Of course, the horses are moving relatively quickly now because they are so freaked out. Well, we all were because of the noise that is encroaching on us. We got out of there too fast for me to be able to properly discern what it was coming towards us. It didn't stop. I know for a fact I saw those large red eyes and the canine ears. It's kind of the same glow to the eyes that you would see in an eye shine when headlights hit eyes, but they were red. I have no explanation for the incredible and disastrous noises coming from the forest headed in our direction. The only thing I really know about that area is that it is really out there in the woods. There would be no reason for somebody else to be out there, since it's all private land. Due to the size and sounds that we heard, I really don't think it was a person. It could have been a large moose or something of that crashing size, but it was incredibly unsettling, and I'm not sure how to summarize the experience other than it freaked us all the hell out and made us very apprehensive about going back down that trail again. This is kind of a long one. A few years ago, my mom was sleeping downstairs, bad idea, and she had an encounter with something inhuman. I used to always get scared at night and knock on their door to sleep with, and one night, my mom heard a knock on her door, and she assumed it was me, so she says, "Come in." While still half asleep, she heard the door open and heard something quickly patter across the ground and jump on the bed, and it began whispering in her ear, mimicking her voice. She freaked out and opened her eyes, only to see a very skinny, small, webbed-looking creature running out of the room. Me and my dad awoke to her screaming. We believe the house was haunted because we all had weird experiences in the house. We believe it came to be that it was haunted because the previous owners were drug addicts who performed satanic rituals and other things. When I showed her the picture of that Skinwalker picture that kind of went viral, she said they looked really similar, but we don't know if this was a Skinwalker or a malevolent spirit. So about a year ago, me and some friends went to a cave by one of their houses. We were in there for about 20 minutes before we hit the back of the cave and nothing was happening. I started to look about the cave with my flashlight and saw a small crawl space and pointed it out. We went in and saw nothing, but the entire area was a smooth dirt-like. It was like it was man-made. When we left the crawl space, we decided to use a voice recorder to try and talk to ghosts. When we asked if we had heard anything, we'd heard nothing until we listened to the recording and heard a voice of like an old smoker, and it basically said, "Leave, go now." It completely disregarded our questions. We took its advice and we started to leave. We had a rock thrown at us, and I turned around and saw a tall, dark black shadow, about 8 feet tall, with dim red eyes. So I just wanted to write this to see what everyone thinks it was. I was sleeping the other night, and I remember waking up, or rather, so it seemed, yet it still felt like I was dreaming. I was lying in my bed and remember sitting up and seeing 3 figures standing in my room with a dim-lit blue light coming from somewhere that illuminated them. I don't remember what exactly they said, or rather, he said, 'cause the one in the middle was speaking directly to me. I remember his mouth opening in a very inhuman way, with the jaw extending further than it should be able to. Their mouth and eyes were black. I mean, not like solid black, but a smoky type of black. So, sort of gray, but you could still recognize teeth and such. I remember them saying something about them coming in a few days for something. I don't remember what it was exactly. I then remember passing back out and waking up. Actually waking up and seeing some dark form dart across the room and hover directly over my bed. My bed is in a corner, so it was sitting hovering between the wall and I, about 4-inch gap at the time. I then felt a very, very intense sense of dread and heaviness throughout my entire fiber and being, and remember feeling this for a few minutes while it was just sitting there, my back turned to it. Then, out of nowhere, a sense of euphoria, great peace had come over me. No longer did I fear or dread anything, but rather, I felt happy, at peace, loved. I don't know how else to describe it. I remember that the thing, whatever it was no longer there. I'm not religious, but I am spiritual, in the sense of believing and following my own route when it comes to what happens after human death. I believe in a very unique form of reincarnation, in which the soul, essence, energy, consciousness, whatever you want to call it, travels until it finds a new place to call home, and it could span across the universe. That being said, I couldn't help but feel like there was an actual evil presence there with me in the room, and a guardian angel, or some other known source of good energy cast it out. I guess I'm just sharing this with my experience and seeing what others have to say about it, as I am entirely unsure as what had happened, and would love to be able to understand it further. I will say this though, whatever it was, it definitely has got me praying last night, and I haven't done that in years, as I seriously feared for my life, but my soul and being as well. This is a retelling of an experience or encounter a friend of mine had many years ago. First, let's give a little background to this. Years ago, when I was between 18 to 20 years old, I was in a little metal band with 4 others, and this incident happened to our bass player in his home, which was also where we would gather for practice. However, it in a way involved all of us. Again, this is his telling of the incident. Also, this was South Texas and in the December timeframe. It happened sometime late at night, according to him. It just started around midnight. He woke up randomly, just felt compelled to look out his window. He was sleeping on the living room couch that night. When he looked, he saw a shadow figure crossing his yard. He said it looked like it was moving quite erratically. His example was like how the doctor moved around in the remake of House on Haunted Hill. Thinking he was just tired and half awake, he thought nothing of it and assumed it was just one of his neighbors, because they were known to do that often, and he went back to sleep. Shortly after that, he woke up with this feeling like somebody holding him down and making it hard for him to breathe, which sure sounds like sleep paralysis to me. Except he claimed the whole time he could hear chanting and whispering all around him, and no one was in the room with him. It eventually stopped abruptly after a minute or two. He sat up confused, terrified, and got a drink of water and tried to go back to sleep, which happened again eventually. Shortly after that, it all happened again. Same feeling, same chanting and whispering. He always said he never knew or could understand exactly what was being chanted and whispered. Regardless, this episode ended and he once again was scared and confused. He chalked this up to maybe he had just had a bad dream and managed to go back to sleep. Then, it all happened again once more. He woke up like something was holding him down, making it hard to breathe. The chanting and whispering all around him again. Though this time, something new happened. He said he looked over next to him on the couch, and standing in front of the Christmas tree was a short, about 4 feet tall shadowy figure that appeared to be cackling at him, though it wasn't making any other noises. This went on for what he said felt like forever this time, and when it stopped, he said forget sleeping and went to his bedroom and played with his bass the rest of the night. Also, for the remainder of the night, coming from the direction of his sister's room, where he would hear 2 knocks every couple of minutes. He didn't go back to sleep until the next night due to this. When the band and I gathered the next day for practice, he told us what had happened, and of course we all laughed and said, "Yeah, right, you're full of it." Then he showed us that in his yard, he found what looked like footsteps tracked through his yard all the way to his front door. The steps were just that, footsteps, made from shoes, but no defining features to them, no imprint of the bottom of the shoe, just plain. Then, when he told around what time this started happening, that it was about 3 a.m. when the last attack happened, We all froze because of what we realized we were doing at night. Our singer woke up randomly and was praying. Our lead guitarist woke up and just could not go back to sleep, feeling like something was wrong and off. And I, for no reason, woke up, turned on my lamp, and just started reading the Bible. We all realized that all of us at the same time was experiencing the incident and had gotten up at 3 a.m. and either prayed, read a Bible, or felt a sense of dread. Our drummer wasn't there at the time, he told us, and he never said if he did anything that night as well. But the story still had him spooked. The story has stuck with me for many years, and I still have no way of explaining it, but I figured you would all like to hear it. My buddy never had another experience like this again. The sun sets awfully early in my neck of the woods, but I still take my dog hiking in the national park, even after my shift. Sadly, it's around 9 or 10 p.m. At the earliest, usually until 11 or midnight. It's been a routine to carry a flashlight, my GPS watch, water, bowl, and my firearm tucked away. It's beautiful to truly be alone and submersed into nature, so I leave behind my phone. No signal here anyway. Half an hour into my last hike, I'm chatting with my dog about my day. Then, I heard a piano. It was faintly playing long, sweet notes towards me from each direction. Cookies instantly went rigid. Her body's stoic and strong. She does not even do this when there's a predator. She will take off running and ask questions later. Though, there wasn't an origin to the sound. It was just thickening in the air, if that makes sense. So, she had nowhere to run. I chalk it up to the wind since its fall and continued forward. 10 minutes in, I heard my voice calling to my dog from the west. It stopped us in our tracks. It sounded raspy, choppy, cut, like somebody had cut and edited my voice. "Cookies, get over here, baby girl." Sounded like Cookies, "Get here, girl." My dog looks at me with such confusion, and I tell her to stay beside me. The voice is much louder. When I say it was louder, it was like the volume had been raised, but not the tone of my voice, which is what Cookie responds to. We start heading back, roughly 30 minutes left. I'm spooked and thinking of the mistakes I made to attract this hot mess. Using the same route, not having a phone on me, using a flashlight, and talking instead of listening, not blessing the hike, wearing a neon yellow vest, not telling my girlfriend when to expect me back. Briskly walking back, the sounds of my voice became more warped and bent, but closer. Cookies and me ended up running the rest of the way. I personally felt like if I looked back to see what was behind me, it would be the last thing that I ever saw. My voice was blaring at this point and filled with anger, booming from both west and east. I have never been more scared nor have ever ran so fast. Cookies was whining and rushing me along, but also wouldn't look back at me. We broke free from the trail. The voices ceased instantly. The sounds of nature returned in its place. I don't know what to think. This was almost a decade ago, and only can remember so much of it given how short of an encounter it was. I was 6 at the time and living at my grandparents'. It was late into the night, far past my bedtime, and I couldn't get any rest, so I woke up and went and made my way to the kitchen to get a cup of water. I had made it into the living room, and being a little kid, was nervous about the dark room already, but got close to the glass doors at the porch to turn on the lights. The light out of the porch was always on at night to deter intruders, like we had an active camera system, but the light was completely blocked out. I figured this out and decided to turn on and face what was causing the problem. A disgusting and massive coyote was staring right back at me and seemed to bite me through the glass. It looked rotted away and seemed to have mange. I was frozen in fear, and after what felt like an eternity staring at this undead beast, it finally gave up and ran off into the cornfield behind my grandparents' house. After that, I finally gathered myself and screamed. I never had a similar experience since, other than strange encounters in my apartment complex, which is somewhat surrounded by forest on the back end, which can lead to strange things, and even stranger people. My boyfriend and I were on our way to meet his parents at a campsite last night, up on a small mountain in central Arkansas. It was dark by the time we got up there, and we were traveling down some pretty windy roads through the forest. We start going past a little field area by the side of the road filled with tall grass, and I saw some eyes reflecting light, super bright, almost like they were lights themselves. I've never seen a normal animal's eyes reflect a light like this. It was weird. The grass was pretty tall, so I only really saw the head, but it looked like it just was some creature literally bouncing through the field. Didn't seem like it had any fur, and I didn't see any ears. It looked like it may have been on 2 feet, because it definitely didn't look like any four-legged animal from its posture alone. We thought it might have been a deer, but we saw some actual deer a few minutes later, and it looked nothing like those. They were smaller, and their eyes weren't reflecting the light like that thing was. I didn't get a super good look, because I only saw it for a few seconds, but it was just weird. It wasn't like my brain spent any time trying to figure out what it was, it just immediately went to fear. Like, that thing isn't normal, get away. There have also been disappearances in that area that fit the criteria for being skinwalker related. Not really related to this story, but my boyfriend's uncle has seen multiple Sasquatch on this mountain too, so there are other cryptids here. Do you think we actually saw a skinwalker? My sister and I take our 5 kids on road trips every year all over the country. This year, in early June, we decided to stay a little closer to her home and drove 6 hours to Fort Davis, Texas. West Texas, by the way. We stayed at a campsite in the state park there in Davis Mountains. The camping sites are broken into groups that branch off the main road. We were the only people in this loop, except for the camp hosts, and they were across the street and 2 or 3 campsites over. Our site was big and surrounded by bushes, and it sat on a small creek. The first night we were there, a big thunderstorm moved in at about bedtime. We had a large tent, and then a small one-person tent for the boys to share. My nephew and my son, ages 8 and 9, were going to sleep in the smaller tent, while the rest of us were in the big one. Once the storm really got going, my nephew became scared and came into the big tent. I didn't want my son to be alone, so I grabbed my pillow and went into the small tent with him. It stopped raining, and we fell asleep. I woke up sometime later. I really have no idea what time it was. I am a pretty light sleeper, so I don't know if I even had heard something. Then, I started to hear a really weird sound, about a foot from the tent on the right side. I can only describe it as what a huge bug with wings, like something the size of my hand, would sound like if it were hitting plastic. Basically, a really loud fluttering noise. But it didn't make sense. It was the middle of the night, and I knew nothing was touching my tent. Then, right underneath this sound came what sounded like an animal-like exhale. Really jagged and almost growling noise. Not human, and from something big. Kinda sounded like the clicker sound from The Last of Us. The sound was about maybe knee level, but both sounds started to travel in front of my tent, toward the creek, no more than a foot away from my tent. There was never an inhale, just a long exhale. Could have been an inhale. Either way, there was no break, and it never changed. Then at the last second, as it's about to pass, I hear feet under it. They sounded like they were coming from heavy work boots of a grown man. After it passed, I got a huge whiff of musky odor, like you get from a wild animal. I was so scared that I couldn't move and had to make myself breathe. I have never felt that kind of fear before, and didn't understand what I had just experienced. The next day, there were no tracks, even though there was a lot of mud around the cars and down by the creek. I thought at first maybe it was a mountain lion, but they are extremely quiet. My sister spoke with the ranger, and they said it was jaggling around down the creek. This was not a pig, okay? There were 2 distinct footsteps underneath it, not 4 little hooves. None of these sounds make any sense together, and I have never heard anything like that breathing or that fluttering sound. Not to mention how big the footsteps sounded for how long the breathing was. If you have any ideas, please share them. Most people think I am making it up or I am exaggerating, but if anything, I am not emphasizing it enough. This was primal terror. I was literally frozen with fear and couldn't feel my body anymore. I have never felt so naive or stupid for being in the wilderness like that before. I want to know what it was. I talked about this experience yesterday and was directed to Skinwalkers. Let me know what you think. I am not native and this was not on a res, but I have seen and felt spirits more than a few times, especially when I am somewhere new. I live in Las Vegas, Nevada, and a popular nature escape for many locals is a nature preserve area called Red Rock Canyon, which is a part of a larger BLM network. This preserve is made of multiple hiking areas and a couple off-road trails for 4x4 vehicles. One of these trails is called the Willow Springs Picnic Area, and off-road trail which connects the La Madre Mountain wilderness, and is home to glyphs left over from the Paiute tribe. Yesterday, my husband and I decided to go on a little excursion into this trail. We took our Ford Escape up this slow, winding trail until we came to a pull-off where we stopped to appreciate the scenery and for me to harvest some prickly pears or cactus fruit to snack on later. About then, a couple jogging or hiking gear with no camping equipment and no supplies or even water power walked up the rough, rocky dirt road. Something was off about this couple. When I nodded to greet them and gave them a simple, "Howdy," they cut me a look of cold aggression and anger, and then in exact unison, they nodded back as though they were copying exactly what I had just done with them. And by in unison, I mean they did it as though they were one person controlling 2 bodies. A few moments later, we pulled up ahead, fully expecting to have passed them on the trail. This trail is meant more for vehicles than people, and if you are going to hike it, you are probably going to find that it is slow going. However, we never ran into them again. It was as if they vanished into thin air. Later, we turned around because it was getting late and we didn't have camping gear, and it felt like something was watching us. When we get back to the parking lot, my husband decided to take some photos, and in several pictures, there were these red eyes peering back at us from the cliffs. Furthermore, this is not the first time we felt like we were being watched on that trail. July 2nd, 2015. While scanning the valley floor for sheep a mile from my house, I noticed 2 loping figures. Initially, I just thought the figures were coyotes or stray dogs, but as the 2 figures neared an old sunken vehicle, I realized that the things were about the size of the vehicle itself, nearly 8 feet long. No animal could be that big on the res. I watched the 2 figures until they disappeared in the woods across the valley. It was starting to get dark, but the moon was bright enough, so I walked without a light. As I walked down the mountain, I heard something yelling. It was like a howl or a yell. I started to hurry. Then, when I got to my house, I locked the door and spent the night listening to the strangest sounds. I'm sure it was a skinwalker, but I found this and was surprised at what I saw. 8 years ago, my brother John was heading home from his girlfriend's house off a country road outside of Boulder, 11 miles south of Pinedale, Wyoming. It was around 1 or 2 a.m. when he saw what he said was a huge dog traversing down the slope of the south side of the road and commencing to run alongside his pickup. He was driving a 6970 Ford F-150 Highboy, which came from the factory lifted. The Dogman was running with him at around 40 miles an hour. There is a 2 to 3 foot barrow ditch running along the road, and the Dogman's head was level with his as he was driving, so John puts its height at around 7 to 8 feet. It was dark in color, with gray or white on its muzzle, running from its nose to under its eyes, which were amber in color. He sped up to 45, and then the Dogman kept up with him, often looking inside the pickup. He said at around 50 miles an hour, he lost it, and that's really all he would ever tell me. I'm a 22-year-old French-Canadian female from Quebec City, and last year, I experienced something out of the ordinary. I was studying in Tahiti, French Polynesian, for about 3 months when I decided to take part in a 2-week field trip to New Caledonia, organized by my host university. Before joining the trip, I had little knowledge of New Caledonia and the culture of the people who live there. Many of my Tahitian friends were somehow a little uncomfortable with staying on Kanaks land due to formal tribal rivalries and magic practice, but I didn't think much of it because, as I said, I knew little about the native culture at the time, and I just thought they were only anxious about leaving the island for the first time. The first week of the trip was amazing. We had so much fun discovering things during the day and partying at night. Then, for the second week, we left the capital to travel to the center of the island, where we would stay a couple days in the mountains and a nice camp. I shared a room with my colleague, Kat, from Quebec, who was part of the exchange program in Tahiti, like me, and entered the trip as well. One night, as our group was heading back to camp from the restaurant where we enjoyed a nice meal, I got blown away by the stars in the sky. I had never seen so many in my life. They were so shiny and sparkling. I stopped walking to look at them, and this is when I felt something weird on my left bare foot. It was a sensation I had never felt before, as if something was caressing my foot with a million little needles. Then, I felt a strong sting, followed by an intense rising pain on the top of my foot. I immediately let out a huge scream of pain, tears rushing to my eyes. It was so bad. My Tahitian friend Hal ran to me and carried me to the camp, where the light showed my foot was already swirling like crazy. My teachers ran to me, wondering what had happened, and when they saw my foot and what looked like a centipede bite, one of them started sucking the venom out of the womb. I couldn't stop crying. I was in so much pain, I was pissed that I didn't get to see the chance to see the thing that had bitten me. South Sea centipedes are poisonous, but they won't kill you. They just hurt like a mother. Another Tahitian friend of mine, Vi, came and poured a Chinese remedy on it, and I felt the pain dim down a little. There was nothing more we could do that night about this incident, so I went to sleep, hoping the day after I would be feeling better. Kat was already sleeping when I got to bed, and I managed to climb onto my bunked bed and fall asleep immediately. It wasn't long that I was awoken by an uneasy feeling. I opened my eyes and saw an imposing dark figure in the right corner of the room. It was standing in the dark just before the door. Fear invaded my body. I tried to scream to wake up Kat, but only a little squeaking noise from my part could be heard. I was totally aware of my surrendering and could see her sleeping in her bed, unaware of the situation. I couldn't move at all. I was paralyzed. My attention was turned towards those 2 red eyes that shone in the corner of the room. I couldn't see its face, but this thing, this creature, certainly was not human. I remember that its arms were so close that it could touch me without even having to move closer to my bed and leave the dark corner of the room. It kept caressing me with its long claws that hung at the end of its large fingers. I could feel the tears running down my cheeks and the panic that was confusing my mind. It caressed me like that, from head to toes for what seemed like an eternity. Then, as it was getting more violent with its touch and approaching furthermore my bed, my Tahitian friend Vi entered the room, unexpected. It vanished immediately, and I sort of woke up panicking. She was only checking on me and my foot. She gave me 2 Tylenol to dim down my fever and the pain. Of course, I tried to tell her that I saw a monster in the corner of my room. And of course, she did not believe me and laughed it off, because, as she was saying, I was being delirious from the poisonous bite. But it felt so real. No need to say that I didn't sleep well that night. I have never seen this entity again, but I still think of it quite often, and I really wonder what this supernatural creature that I saw that night in New Caledonia. I never suffered from night terrors or sleep paralysis before, and this is why I keep thinking that I encountered a creepy entity that night, and for some reason, it is linked to this centipede bite. I have been doing some research on the signification of centipedes in the Kanak culture, as well as the Tahitian culture, but nothing matches the description of the events of that night. Since this encounter, I have been calling centipedes demon creatures, and to this day, I have never walked barefoot on grass again. I was on a walk about a month ago, and I was almost home. I saw something that looked like a white golden brown husky with bright blue eyes, but something felt really off about it. Its face seemed longer than a regular dog's. Its color was also kind of off for a husky. I don't really remember much about its body because of how freaked out I got. I wasn't exactly sure what to do, so I tried to act like I didn't feel anything was off. I accidentally made eye contact with it and stopped walking, and for some reason, I'm not sure. I felt too afraid to move. It was about 10 feet away, and it walked up to me and then past me. We maintained eye contact, even as it walked past me, until I heard somebody else on the street, and when I looked back at the thing, it was running away like a deer. I don't really see many deer anymore, but that's the only way I can describe how it moved, just like that one scene from Bambi, like prancing away almost. I would have thought I just had seen a regular coyote, if not for the coloring, the almost human-like eye contact, and the awful feeling I got when I saw it. Does anyone else know if I saw a skinwalker or not? Does anyone know what I saw? What did I see that day? I've been asking myself that question for a while now. Honestly, just thinking of retelling this story makes me scared. I can't remember exactly what year it was. Maybe 2014 or 2015. I lived near a forested area out by Glenpool, Oklahoma. Between my house and my step-grandparents' house is the forested area. It's a bit of a walk, but not that bad. So, one day, my mom was at my step-grandparents', and I was leaving their house to head back to my house, so, of course, I went to the forested area. I always liked going through there, but it was filled with birds singing, and besides the constant traffic, it was peaceful. But something changed. The birds didn't sing, the wind didn't blow, and there was silence. I couldn't even hear the traffic at this time, and that's when it happened. My mother was calling my name, but I was so confused. Her voice came from deeper into the woods, away from both houses. So I looked around, and just like that, she called me again, and again, and I followed for only a couple of minutes, until all of a sudden, my entire body started going, "Get out of there now." And I turned to walk back to my house, and right when I did, the second I turned to look, I saw a black figure staring down at me from a hill. It was in the shade, and I didn't stop to ask what it was. Oh no. I hauled ass out of there, back to the step GPS, and I ran to my mom, instantly telling her what had happened. She didn't believe me. "You were just imagining it." So I thought she was right. Maybe I was, but then I got curious and asked why she was calling my name from the houses. She wasn't, and I know my mom's voice. That was her exact voice. I let it go, and soon after we moved elsewhere. I don't know how this happened, but the thing followed me, because after my cousin left the house and I was in bed trying to sleep, right outside of my window, I heard my cousin's voice. But this wasn't like the woods. It was right by my head, since the window is right above where I sleep. It was a name my cousins call me, and that's what was said outside my window. But it was wrong. It was all garbled up like a bad recording, and my entire body froze up in fear, and it kept going, but I ignored it and ended up passing out. To this day, I haven't had any more problems. Well, that I know of. But it wasn't what I saw the figure. It wasn't the voices. It was this feeling of dread that I was going to die if I didn't get out of there. It's, well, easily the most scared that I've ever been. Late summer, back in 2009, I was visiting family that lived outside of Memphis in the evening time. I was driving in the truck with my brothers and cousins from my dad's side of the family. We were heading to their property to go feed the horses and livestock. It was a longer drive. We ended up having to take a small dirt road that went quite a ways off the main road for quite some distance. Just like out of a horror movie, my brothers get a call from their mom, who's at the house, to just see where they were. They got her on speakerphone, and they're having casual conversation for the most part. Then they start talking about how the horses have acted really spooked all day long and are acting strange. My brothers say that they have noticed that too, and they're not sure why, since that hardly if ever happens. I kid you not even a couple minutes later, this freak of nature looking dog thing steps out across the road, looks at our vehicle, and quickly darts into the woods. All of us were screaming, "Did you see that?" My stepmom was still on the phone with my brothers, and we're all freaking out. Whatever it was had long, brown, shaggy hair, a massive dog head with lots of teeth and huge claws on its hands. I distinctly remember it tucking its arms and hands up to its body, like a T-Rex does when it ran across the road. I also vividly recall it having long 12-inch black claws off each of its fingertips. For whatever reason, my eyes went right to its hands. Maybe because it looked so terrifying. The hands reminded me a lot of raccoon hands, actually, just with really long, large claws. I briefly saw the face, but it happened so fast, I think I just spent more time taking it all in. After more freaking out and trying to make sense of it, I almost wonder if that's what had caused the horses to act up. They only lived a couple of miles away from the spot we saw this thing. They had been acting up all morning long, and then that happened in the evening. When it crossed the road, it seemed to come from the general direction of our house, so I wouldn't be surprised if that was the case. I have truly no idea though. I do remember that evening, the horses seemed to be a little more calmed down, and the following day, they were okay. I don't think any of us could really put a finger on exactly what it was we saw, but my brothers say it was an alien dog or something. It just looked like a big, upright, hairy wolf dog. I've thought about the whole werewolf thing too, but I don't know. Werewolves are usually painted in a much more human-like light than this thing was. It was just full-on wild animal. You could tell by the way it looked and moved. Very humanoid looking, but like a wild beast. I do recall seeing its hair blowing a little bit in the wind as it dove across the road after seeing us. From what I can remember about seeing the body, it was very lean. There were muscles rippling by where its front of its body was, like the chest and stomach. I remember that. I know for a fact that this was not a bear, wolf, regular dog, coyote, nothing that I've ever seen before. That's the weirdest thing. Even though it looked very dog-like, it didn't look exactly like just a dog standing there. Like I said, it was very humanoid and looked like its own being. Its face, from what I remember, was more wolf-like in appearance, but still very dog-like. I want to say that I'm being honest and sharing this sensitive information. I know there's a lot of people I could just openly tell this story to because I would be mocked and criticized for such things. I'm here to tell you there are things beyond our imagination that we don't know about living out there. I was a pretty big skeptic of things too, that I didn't normally or couldn't normally see with my own eyes. I used to believe that if there were any unknown species of anything living in North America, especially the woods, we would know by now due to our dense population and a technology of exploration. I guess I was wrong and can happily admit that. I was on a cross-country trip with my 13-year-old son some years back. We were headed to a hotel and were currently in Arkansas at the time. It was nighttime and we were lost and both of our phones were dead, so we were kind of just driving around aimlessly. I can't tell you the exact road we were on because I don't remember. I can tell you we were somewhere close to Highway 27, as that is the last road I remember. I also remember us being on a 2-lane highway and my son complaining that he had to pee real bad, so we pulled over. There is thick forest around us, and especially where I pulled off to, so I figured it would be the perfect spot for him to run up into the trees and relieve himself. Using his phone as a flashlight, he wandered off about 20 feet just into the tree line. I'm sitting there in the car, checking my phone to see if I can get anything, and I hear what sounds like footsteps sprinting to my car. I turn my head to look over and my son's frantically opening the door, jumping in and screaming at me to go, go, go. He's yelling and being crazy, and I'm trying to calmly talk to him and figure out what just happened, and he starts getting really emotional and begging me to go and not explaining anything. This was out of character for my son. He never acted like this. My son by nature is very quiet and collective. He's a good boy, and he's been out with me on all sorts of adventures. He's definitely not a scaredy cat. In fact, when he was younger, he's the one who decided to stick his whole arm in an ant mound, but that's a different story. Something spooked him this time so bad that he was totally acting weird. So I pulled out of there, and we're driving down the road, and I'm trying to figure out if he even got to use the bathroom. He doesn't even acknowledge the question, and instead just tells me there was a big wolf that he had ran into in the tree line. What? When I asked him, what do you mean wolf? He said this thing was the size of a grizzly bear and standing on 2 legs. He said it stuck its hand out to try and grab him, but ended up turning around and ran back to the car just in time. The scariest thing he told me is, Dad, I'm 13 and I don't believe in monsters, but that was a real-life monster. I know many parents would blow their child off and tell them they probably just saw something that spooked them. I've raised my son to be very logical and analytical. I teach him to question everything, and I believe my son saw something because I even try to reassure him that maybe in the poor lighting, it was just a bear. He explains to me that because he was so close to this thing, he got a good look at it, or at least enough of a look at it, and said their bears don't have teeth like this, Dad. Of course, this was years ago, and he is now 20. We just recently brought up this event again in conversation, and he goes, Dad, I guess what I seen that night is what they call a dogman. I guess they are all over America, and I happened to see one. I asked him if they are like werewolves, and he said no, that they're just upright walking canine cryptids. I'm not too sure what I think about the whole thing, but it is interesting, and I thought you would like me to share it with you. They come in through the wall. I don't know how they do it, but that's where they start. In the middle of my apartment, walking out of the dining room wall, I could hear their footsteps. They plod along my floor. The floor creaks in some parts. The friction of little feet on the carpet makes a slight sound as they walk toward my bedroom. I knew I didn't want to go to sleep, but I couldn't fight the overwhelming wave of tiredness that came over me. Now, I wait, unable to sleep as the footsteps draw near. They always knock something off of my art table, which sits outside my door. I'm surprised they're so clumsy. The footsteps are mostly quiet, but I could hear them a little louder now. They're in the bedroom. They're at the foot of my bed. I can move if I want to, but I don't want to. I don't want to look. I fall asleep as fast as the footsteps stop. In the morning, I awake refreshed, recharged as if I've just had the best sleep of my life. That's the way it happens every single time. I hadn't forgotten these memories, but they had never had context before. When things are too strange, it's a struggle to understand them. In cases like those, I often find myself undecided about them, and simply file the memories away until I can make sense of them. That seems to be the case for a few memories which, having some context for them, came back to me shortly after my visits began. The first one that came to my mind was my clear UFO sighting. I was riding passenger in a friend's car with another friend in the back seat. We were heading north on Highway 3 in Houston, Texas, and it was about 10 p.m. Ryan was in the back seat texting on his flip phone, which was new tech at the time. I believe this was in either 2005 or 2004, but please, forgive me if I'm unsure. The driver, whom I will call Bob, was jamming out to some music, and we're all thinking to ourselves as he drove with no real destination in mind. I had a strange feeling, an urge to look up. I can't say why. I rolled down the window and looked up into the night sky, not expecting to see the giant craft above us. I was astounded. There were 3 white lights forming a huge triangle, and between them was the darkest color of black you could possibly imagine. The stars would disappear within the triangle, only to reappear behind it. The tip of it was facing the direction that we drove, and it was clearly following us. It was directly over the top of us and matching our speed, which was approximately 55 miles an hour. The craft itself was incredibly large, and I estimate it to have been several hundred feet from any one point of it to the next. It was moving silently and too slowly to fly, if it was a plane or a jet, of course. We were used to jets roaring by around there, as we were near a former airbase, but it would still often host various AF jets. This was certainly not one of them. I pulled my head back inside the car and tried like hell to get my friends to look at it. I implored Ryan first, as he wasn't driving. He simply kept staring at his phone and said, "Nah, I'm not going to do that." I tried even harder to get either one of them to look. "Guys, there is a UFO directly above us. This is probably a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. It's right there, you have to look at it." Bob turned the radio to full blast, laughing as if I were full of shit. Ryan ignored me. I poked my head back out the window and looked up at the craft, which was still following us. I began to think of words to speak to it, which were something along the lines of, "What are you guys doing up there?" In the millisecond between thought and speech, as if reacting to my thought before I could utter a word, it took off toward the horizon at an amazing speed and didn't make any noticeable sound. Bob may have turned his crappy standard car stereo up, but it would not have masked the sound of a jet. I had decided that our proximity to an Air Force base was the reason for the sighting, and that the craft was likely a top-secret aircraft. Only after my visits began did I think that there may have been another explanation. It was following us, after all. Within a couple of weeks, I was visiting Bob at his condo, and noticed that his forearm was bleeding. Ryan was there, sitting on his bed, texting on his phone again. Bob took a Zippo lighter to his arm, and caused me to finally ask, "What?" He said that a bump had formed on his arm, and he didn't like it. He cut it out with a knife, and it came back. This time, he cut it out and was burning the area. I thought it was very bizarre, but he was a pretty screwed up person, so I left it alone. Later that day, I had occasion to rub my forearm when I discovered it. I had a bump on the same left forearm and in the same spot as Bob. I was inclined to ask Ryan if he had one too. It didn't hurt, or have any sensation really. It was as if BB had been encased in a thin layer of cartilage and was just under all of the layers of my skin. Ryan insisted that he didn't have a bump. I reasoned with him that I didn't know I had one until just then, and maybe he should check. He was too engrossed in his phone to care. When the opportunity arose, I grabbed his left forearm and felt for a bump. He had one too, and in the same spot as Bob and I. Being Ryan though, he didn't care. It's sort of just how the guy is. Another memory also found context because of my visits, and I will retell it soon. Anyone being visited by a highly advanced and intelligent species in the middle of the night might begin to think they're losing it. I'm pretty sure all of us have considered the idea, especially given the stigma surrounding the subject. I was no exception. In 2009, I began dating a woman who lived on the other side of the city. She lived in a house with a roommate, so we found intimacy much easier if she drove to my apartment when my son was away at his mother's house. She would often spend the night, and we did what couples do, the fun parts. One weekend morning, we were making breakfast in the kitchen when I noticed a long and deep scratch on my arm that wasn't there before. We did not drink, so there wasn't a chance that I'd scrape myself that hard without noticing, or even remembering it. She didn't recognize it either. We thought little of it, though it was strange. She and I spent the day together, made art, and went to bed again that night. I hadn't told her of the visitors yet, but they seemed to not care for other people in my life, so I didn't worry. When we woke the next day, I felt like I was on top of the world. The scratch on my arm was gone, as we discovered while making breakfast again. Not a trace, no scab, no scar. It was as if it had never happened. It was odd, but again, we dismissed it. 2 weeks later, she came again to spend the weekend with me. On the first night, we didn't feel like fooling around, and so we laid in my bed, looking at the ceiling, talking before going to sleep. Suddenly, a bright blue light shone in through my window and directly onto the wall in front of us. She looked at it curiously and asked, "What is that light?" I remember saying it's probably just one of my fans before we both fell instantly asleep. We woke the next morning, both very well rested. I always asked her in the morning, "How did you sleep?" The answer was typically that she struggled to sleep through my snoring, and I felt pretty badly about it most mornings with her. She was sweet about it, but always honest. This particular morning, however, she said that she had slept better than she had ever in her life. This statement caused me to be and have a very solemn feeling. After brushing our teeth and making up for the night before, don't make me spell it out, we were both on the front porch having a cigarette, and I studied the window to my bedroom. I live on the second floor, and there is a mighty and thick magnolia tree in front of the window. I remember the light, and judging by the angle of it, it would have to be about 15 feet off the ground, and in between the magnolia tree and my window. I pointed out these things to her as well. She thought it was very unusual and asked, "Who were you talking about when you mentioned your fans last night?" I realized that I had no idea why I said that. Later that evening, I decided to tell her about my visitors. Thankfully, it didn't scare her away. As I've mentioned before, some events are so odd that I file them away in my mind as undecided. I've had experiences that made too little sense to understand and couldn't glean from the memory of anything that would bring clarity. After my visits, however, some of them finally began to make sense. It was approximately the year 1998 when this event occurred, and my longtime friend Ryan was there for this one as well. We were hanging out at a friend's apartment, playing video games. At some point in the night, around 8 p.m., everybody got hungry. Ryan and I volunteered to go to the local Jack in the Box, which was only a block away, to get everybody's food. We took a gigantic order, written on paper, which was customary at the time, and set out in his car to go on a food run. When we pulled into the drive-thru, we warned the order taker that this would be a very big order, as it was for 6 people. As you might expect, they took the order and asked us to park in the parking lot to wait. After about 8 minutes or so, they come out with our food, and we drove to a gas station for cigarettes, and headed immediately back to the apartment. The entire run took, about 20 minutes? Or so we thought. When we returned, everybody was freaking out. "Where the heck are you guys? Where did you go?" they asked. I said something to the effect of, "Well, it was a big order, and we told you it would take a while." They insisted that we had been gone for nearly 2 hours. Ryan and I were incredulous. We thought they were pranking us. They said that they had called the local police, jails, hospitals, because they were genuinely worried that we had died or gotten arrested or something. I didn't believe them. I looked at the clock on the microwave, and it reflected that we had been gone for about an hour and a half. I still didn't believe it. A friend showed us his watch, which had the same time. Ryan and I still thought they were just pulling a prank and had changed the clocks to mess with us. Then I remembered that Ryan's car had a clock in it, and they didn't have a key. "Hey, Ryan, go check the clock in your car and see what time it really is," I said. He came back with a grim expression on his face, pointing to the clock in the microwave. He said, "That's the correct time." Now I thought he was in on the joke, even though such a thing was outside of his nature. I demanded to go to his car to see for myself. The time matched. It remained the correct time as time passed, all night long. They weren't lying. The strangest part to me was that the food was still warm when we showed up. Fast food congeals a bit and changes texture after an hour, but this wasn't the case. No one knew what to think, including me. So I filed it away in my mind until sometime around 2010, when things finally began to start adding up. My family went to visit my brother in Luling, Texas for Thanksgiving in 2012. My son, mother, grandfather, and I piled into my mother's truck, and we drove out to the middle of nowhere. When we got to my brother's remote dwelling, I thought, if they were going to come get me tonight, this would be the perfect place. I didn't really think that they would. We arrived on the day of Thanksgiving and did the usual family thing. As it came close to bedtime, we sorted out the various people and made arrangements. There were 12 people staying there that night and were of various ages. There was a baby, a toddler, some school-aged kids, a few middle-aged adults, and 2 older people. To say that the scene was chaotic is an understatement. We had visited before, and by experience, I knew that there was never a time when everybody was asleep simultaneously. I decided to stay awake that night, wanting to draw all night long. I went to the porch for a cigarette, and when I returned indoors, everybody was already asleep. The old floor creaked as I walked, and I began to feel guilty for potentially keeping everybody awake. I resigned to sleep after all and lay down in the guest bed, falling asleep instantly. That night, I had a very strange and detailed dream. I was the first to wake, and I went outside to have a cigarette and reflect on the dream, which was still fresh in my mind. I remembered every detail, but dismissed it as any other person might. It was just a dream, I thought. In the dream, I was sitting in a chair in a darkened room. 2 beings were behind me, and I could hear them remarking about what I was doing at the console before me. There were some strange types of controls before me that I used my hands to manipulate, and the display for this device was projected directly into my mind, almost like seeing it in VR. It was like a game. I was directing the actions and speech of every person in my brother's home, making sure that everyone politely took turns in the single bathroom there, being able to use the restroom, shower, and brush their teeth. I also programmed my own actions, as well, including dialogue that I would say to everyone. Every time I avoided conflict, a sound would happen as if I had made a lot of points in a video game. I was avoiding conflict and negative emotions left and right, organizing everyone's actions perfectly, and making sure everyone's needs were met. The scenario ended with me, my son, my mother, and grandfather climbing into my mother's truck and driving away. When it was done, I once again saw the console before me in the darkened room. The 2 figures behind me, which I never bothered to look at, were babbling back and forth about how well I did. I thought of all of this and went inside. Then it began. The symphony of harmony that I directed the night before happened exactly as I had designed it. Every person said what I had programmed them to say. They ate what I had designed and even ate what I had programmed for them to eat. As my son walked past me with a peanut butter sandwich, it became clear that the dream was coming true, down to the detail. Their dialogue matched so precisely that I began to freak out. Every single action, including my own, was scripted. In my mind, I was screaming, "Holy cow, this is actually happening. I can't tell anyone, or they'll think I'm crazy." Just stick to the script. Just stick to the script. As I sat thinking, my brother's wife came and asked me a question. I didn't want to stick to the script. I wanted to scream. I wanted to freak out and run out of the house, screaming at the top of my lungs, but I stayed outwardly calm. I responded as I had designed. All 11 people used the bathroom and ate, and a few of us watched as my son played with his early birthday present out in the front of the yard. It was a remote-control truck, and I waited for him to crash it in the ditch, just as I had designed. When he did, I walked over and picked it up, turning it back toward him so that he could drive it back. After lunch, we climbed into my mother's truck and began the long drive home. Within 2 minutes, my son and grandfather were asleep in the back seat, and the truck became quiet. I looked over at my mother and said, "Mom, you wouldn't believe what happened last night. I don't want to talk about it, but I'm just glad it's over." She replied, "I probably would believe it." We didn't speak again until we returned to our city, and I still don't know how to process the event. I write these accounts in hopes that someone may recognize aspects of them and help me to form some communal understanding about what has happened. If you feel familiar with any of this, please let me know. Be specific or even make a post here about if it's long enough. I still don't fully understand any of what happened, and all I can do is describe the events in as much detail as possible. It so happened that after being visited for a while, I fell in love. The woman and I are estranged, and I'll skip most of the details, for that is not the point of this account. What I began to experience, however, I believe to be a side effect of communicating with a telepathic being. Here are a few things that happened as bullet points. I began to have remote viewing completely without effort and at 100% accuracy. I had a telepathic bond with someone and can feel their presence. I began to have deep sympathy for humankind, animal life, and all of life. I believe that part of this is how it occurred was that I was in love and somewhat fixated on this person. She was weird, and she stalked me, sort of. I would find her in random places in my apartment complex, late at night, crying. I felt it when she was there. She sometimes borrowed a friend's car and parked it in different places in my parking lot. I always knew how to find her. Sometimes I didn't go, even though I felt her. It was strange too because she was never upset with me for it. She was comfortable by me being there, but didn't always seek me out, except when she was on my front porch and I would wake up and find her there. It was a weird love story, and I promised to keep it short. I lost her love earlier on than I knew, and greatly because I had told her about the visits. But she visited me too. Everything was strange back then. The whole world sang to us, and it was magical. I'll never know how much the visitors had to do with these things, but I can't help but think they had a weird-looking little hand in many of these experiences. My contact with her and contact with them ended very close together in the same month, back in 2015. I'm trying to recount the entire experience overall, which I have never committed to writing and have not told many people about. The few people that I have to speak about it are uncomfortable with the subject. Thank you for reading this. It's a story that needs to be told, and I'm better off doing it anonymously, as there's no benefit to being shown by doing it, and it can simply be read and processed by each person. I can't be the only person reading this who has had these experiences. I hope it strikes a chord with somebody. I set my mind to remember the next visit in full detail, and pressed my determination to break free of whatever hypnotic trance that they kept me in, down to the core of my subconscious mind. I made it my sole intent, superseding even the desire to eat that night. I felt the desire to stay awake again, and the sudden wave of sleepiness that followed it. I knew what was about to happen, and secretly, even partially hidden from my own conscious thoughts, readied myself to break free and take control of the situation. The footsteps began, and they softly padded toward my room, knocking down yet another of my perilously balanced art supplies along the way. I was no longer afraid, but I lay still. They reached the bed, and I felt instantly asleep once again. I felt myself coming back, fighting through the haze of sleep to force myself awake. Upon regaining my sight, I saw that I was laying horizontally, staring up at a darkened metal ceiling. Beside me was a being with very human eyes, looking at my torso. His eyes were large but slanted slightly, somewhat like my own, and with very long eyelashes and dark, thick eyebrows. His head was bulbous but came to a ridge at the top, and his skin was colored just as that of a Caucasian human being. He had no nose, having rather a long snout-like mouth that came from his face like a rigid tube of flesh, tapering outward at the end, somewhat like the bell of a trumpet. His ears were pointed at the top, much as those like elves are depicted to have in fairy tales. He looked toward my head and noticed my eyes looking into his. I could feel him probing my mind in curiosity, wondering if I had regained consciousness. My body was tied down with straps of some sort, and looking to my right side, I saw another human being in presumably the same state as myself. She was strapped to a metal table, which protruded from the wall with no additional support, and as I scanned my environment, it appeared that we were in a circular room which was dimly lit. There were several metal table-like beds protruding from the outer wall like spokes in a wheel, each approximately 7.5 feet long, and each containing other humans who appeared to be in a complete trance. I looked back to the strange being before me, who wore a surprisingly ordinary white lab coat, projecting my thoughts into his mind as he looked at me with furrowed brows. I demanded, "Let me go!" His brows furrowed further, expressing very clear concern. His probe of my mind began more and more earnestly, and I realized that he had not understood my demand. I was thinking in words, in English. I reasoned, and he did not know my language. I looked more deeply into his eyes, becoming slightly angry with him. A technique that I had learned as a child came back to me, an experience that I had only practiced alone. I have never spoken or written of it before now. Using my internal force, my spirit, I pushed outward from my body with my mind and spirit, creating an intense pressure and a spherical pattern around me. The being stumbled back a few steps, bumping into the lady who lay on the table next to us. His eyes had an expression of surprise. He stepped forward again and tried to probe my mind for a third time, but I would not allow it. The very moment that I felt his presence in my thoughts, I took hold of his mind completely, blocking out his own ability to think. I forced his thoughts out of his own mind and filled it with my own, which was now simply an angry, overwhelming scream. Mixed in with this violent psychic episode, I envisioned him unstrapping me from the table and letting me stand. This was my way of repeating my original demand, and I held him in there in this way for approximately a full minute, whereupon he could no longer move nor think any thoughts of his own. Upon releasing him, I looked back into his eyes with my full intent displayed in my expression. He faltered for a few steps, and then ran away through a large opening which served as an entryway into the room. I looked around the room again, trying to memorize its details. The room was circular, so far as I could see it. It was dimly lit from an undetermined source, and had a large cylindrical machine standing vertically in the center of the room which contained some apparent mechanical controls. The walls, floor, ceiling, and beds were made of unpainted metal, and had the appearance of stainless steel. I looked over again to the woman beside me, whose bed was closest to the doorway. She was moving her head about as someone might when tossing in their sleep. It appeared to me that she was dreaming. I called out, hoping to wake her, and she turned to look at me once before, looking back to the ceiling, and going back into her dreamlike state. Within another minute's time, 2 large reptilian men came into the room and began walking swiftly toward me. Much like the first being, they wore surprisingly ordinary-looking clothes. They wore blue scrubs, much like nurses in a hospital. They were not like nurses in their appearance, however. They were at least 7 feet tall and very muscular, with nails protruding from holes seamed in at the back of their pants. The shade of their skin was a deep green and resembled the color of a typical alligator. Their heads were more like those of a Komodo dragon, set atop a humanoid body covered in scaly reptilian skin. Their faces had little room for expression, though I sensed that they were frustrated with me as they hastily unstrapped me from the table and allowed me to stand. I spoke out loud, and one of them hissed at me before pushing me out of the room. I walked through a bright white hallway with, again, no discernible light source, and they walked at either side of me. Every so often, they would push me into one corridor or another so that I continued walking, making turns into the other hallways as I was pushed toward them. In this manner, we proceeded until I had completely lost my bearings, at which point we reached the destination, a small, moderately lit room containing a simple metal table and a single metal chair. Toward the back corner of the room was another door, so that there were two doors diagonally opposite of each other. I walked to the center of the room and pulled out the amazingly lightweight metal chair, upon which I took my seat. The wait was not long. I heard a British accented voice in my mind, one full of curiosity and sounding mildly amused. "Well, now isn't this a surprise?" the man's voice spoke into my thoughts. "It sure is," I replied sarcastically. "You've hurt that technician very badly, and I'd like to ask that you do not do it again," he said. "Don't make me then." "Of course," he replied politely. "I presume you forced your way here for some reason, and I could see that you want knowledge. What is it that you would like to know? What am I doing here? What do you want with me?" I had asked. With those words, I felt a kind of cue that would cut the formality of thinking in words, as if an invitation for more true telepathic communication was given. Though we spoke without using words, my thoughts are formatted in English, and his understanding of the language was necessary for the exchange we were about to make. The understandings came so clearly that I could easily transcribe the conversation into English, but I may need to use approximations in words so that I might convey it here more easily. I have since dubbed this character the Brain, since he was clearly the head of this operation, and will refer to him as such during the rest of the account. He says, "We do not understand how you form your decisions. Your thought processes do not make any sense to us, but they clearly seem to make sense to you. We want to understand your thinking and emotion in the same way that you do." And I said, "Oh, that's easy. All you had to do was ask." "I wish it were so easy. You were such a messy creature, and we prefer not to deal with so many of you." "You're right about that. It can be confusing sometimes. I'll make a deal with you. I will teach you more than anyone has ever about human thinking, but I want knowledge in exchange. I do not usually make bargains. You don't usually have a human sitting in this chair after injuring one of your technicians telepathically." "You are correct. I believe that you will be of great use to us in our mission. What knowledge do you desire?" "I have another term of this arrangement which must be honored if we are to continue." "Which is?" "You cannot take my son, or any of the people that I know, unless they have separately given you their own consent." "Don't worry. You do not remember this, but we have agreed upon that already." "Thank you. I am grateful. I wish to know the true nature of reality. I want to see what is hidden from me, and understand what I experience that I might not usually perceive. Such knowledge has killed men before. I do not know if you can bear it." "I can handle a little at a time. We should arrange that we exchange equal amounts of knowledge during each visit." The Brain became amused. "You'd get very little for that. What we learn from you is by small comparison to what you hope to gain." "I'll take what I can. I do want this to be a fair arrangement for both of us, after all." "You are honorable for that. Because of this, I will give you more than what you have asked for. But the knowledge given will not exceed your mental limits." Upon making this agreement, we began a short period of even deeper telepathic communication. Our minds lay open to each other, and he was able to learn anything from my body of knowledge, and I was allowed to do the same with his. The exchange lasted for only around 1.5 minutes, at which point I began to feel very tired. "What do you look like?" I'd finally asked. "To show you my visage is to show you my name," he replied. In his statement, it was implied that by his appearance, his name, I can find him anywhere telepathically. He seemed hesitant and a little worried. I reassured him, I do not wish to do to you as I have done to your servant. I believe that your mind is stronger than my own, and it would be foolish and unwise of me to attempt the same with yourself. He agreed. I was directed by my thoughts to look toward the top of the wall and adjoining part of the ceiling, just above the door opposite of the one which I had entered. The wall and ceiling became transparent for a moment, and I saw him in a room diagonally above me, looking down through the wall. He appeared grumpy, despite the warmth he had experienced during our conversation. I remember thinking that it was just his usual expression and that he likely did not intend to appear that way. I never knew that I looked angry, he said. The wall became solid again, and the room became dark. I opened my eyes to myself laying in my bed. I was late for work. I'm standing there in the round room, but this time, I'm in the back behind the big rectangular structure, which I refer to as a box, next to the bunk beds in the shadows. I'm with a friend, and we'll call him Frank. He'd get the joke if he knew I was telling this. We're both looking at each other in slight confusion, fully clothed, standing in a relatively dark place. We didn't see anyone else at first. A telepathic conversation ensued between us as we looked at each other, still. I said, "We're here with others. Remember how we talked about the fact that even though they're scary looking, we shouldn't actually be afraid of them, and that's why they keep us in a trance?" He responded with a simple yes. "Well," I continued, "we've got to do that now. We have got to get past the fear response to seeing them. It's the only way they'll let us stay awake." For context, imagine it for a moment, as you'll understand. As a kid and growing up, you've seen all manner of fluffy and cute earth creatures, and even a few scary-looking ones. In your mind, you formed an idea of what earth creatures look like, and how to spot the most intelligent ones. You're not ready for them. They don't look like they're from Earth, and even the ones who could be are too big and intelligent to belong here. It's scary to see any of them, because they're so foreign to the eyes. They're looking at you. They're smarter than you. They could do whatever they want to do at any time to you or anyone, and they're standing right in front of you. It's scary. And this is what I'm asking Frank to fight. This response, like seeing a mountain lion on a remote trail, only worse. Like being alone in the woods and finding a big bear, only worse. What we have to fight in order to stay awake. And then we see them. They were standing just a few feet away the entire time, a boy and a girl. They were approximately in their adolescence, and it was somehow understood upon introduction. Neither one of them was wearing clothes. They were human and reptilian hybrid children, and they were looking at us curiously, as if we were there to teach them something. Or honestly, it was like an arranged playdate, like I used to do for my son and the other kids. That's what it felt like. So, as you are probably wondering, what did these two scary-looking kids look like? Well, for starters, they were mostly green. It was a deep green, not shaded brown though, and I must admit that my description of color is lacking here. They were the color of a common anole lizard, essentially, but with smoother skin and scales. Their faces were more human than reptile, but colored green and given to mild scales toward the edges. Okay, this is weird, but I feel like I'm letting these kids down by describing them too well. Let's just say that, by the pink human-looking patches on their bodies and the human-esque features, you would have been able to guess that they were hybrids just by looking at them. Each one approached us separately, the female looking at me, and the male coming to Frank. We engaged in telepathic conversations with them, and it was pretty cool. 4 people having a telepathic chat was really damned interesting, and I wish I could do this with other humans. I'm going to keep what we talked about between the 4 of us, but it was innocent stuff, really. They asked us a lot of questions about life on Earth, and were very interested in us telling them everything. It was probably the entire point of the visit, other than the fact that they both had said they were very lonely. They were the most human things in the place allowed to remain conscious, and they had wished to talk to some real humans, who were in essence their relatives. I get from most of these recovered conversations that the visitors are not very good at emotions, and these poor kids only had half-asleep humans to relate to most of the time. This is why Frank and I were allowed to remain awake and talk to them like people. They needed it, developmentally, to be understood by intelligent and emotional beings just like themselves, even though they're scary as hell to look at. Keeping a timeline for all this has been pretty tough. I don't know what they do to people, but it makes remembering this sort of thing difficult. I've been using past girlfriends as reference points in time to help me contextualize all of this, and if it hadn't been for these wonderful women, I wouldn't know when many of these things happened relative to each other. The following occurred before the visit to my brother's house, before the memory control device experience. Things were getting strange, and it was difficult keeping it to myself. I experienced this before I knew of the term, but it certainly applies. I was experiencing high strangeness. It's hard to describe how weird life became. The fact that I was trying to hide my experience from most of the people I knew wasn't making life any easier. You may have noticed that I've always had a strained relationship with my mother. She's the meanest woman I know, and I often compare my childhood to being raised by the Emperor from Star Wars. The woman is pretty much the epitome of evil, but she's the only mom I have, and I love her anyway. We were on the back patio of a restaurant one day with my son and her boyfriend, and I just couldn't hold back any longer. The boy was off playing about 20 feet away and was occupied by a sandbox well enough that he couldn't overhear us talking. I just came out with it. "Mom, I think I'm being abducted by aliens." She laughed, but it only took a few seconds for her to look over and see my anguish. I wasn't laughing with her. I was distraught. I'll do my best to approximate what each of us said because I remember the content clearly, but the wording not as well. "Mom, I'm serious. It's messing me up too bad. I don't know how to deal with it. I can't tell my son or anyone, really. I'm not going crazy. This is happening. I don't know why I'm even telling you. I'm sorry. It's changed how I look at the world, life, everything." That's when she decides to confide in me as well. Her boyfriend is already sitting there stunned, incredulous, but what she says next took both of us by surprise. "I've never told anyone this story, but now seems like the time to say it," she began. "It was December, and I was 9 months pregnant with you. I was sitting on the front porch with your father, and we were watching the sunset. Mind you, I was a preacher's wife and pregnant, so I didn't do any drugs, didn't smoke cigarettes. I didn't even drink tea." This line always stands out to me and is an exact quote. We're sitting there, looking off in different directions, and there was pretty much nothing around for miles but cow pastures. I noticed another sun in the sky, and it was in the wrong place. I had just been looking over at the sunset in the other direction, but off to the other side was another ball of light in the sky. It wasn't too bright, and I could look at it, and I knew it wasn't the sun. So I'm looking at this thing, completely in awe, thinking, what is that thing? And it starts moving. It comes down and moves behind a row of trees, and I feel like it's watching me. I'm so shocked that I can't even speak, and the whole thing only lasts for about a minute. It starts moving back and forth behind the trees, and I could see it shine through. It was a small row of trees, not thick like a forest, and I could clearly see the ball of light back there, moving back and forth, watching me. It creeped me out. I finally get my senses together and move my head toward your father, who is looking in the complete opposite direction, but I never look away from that thing. As I put my hand on his shoulder, and I'm just about to tell him to look, it shot right out straight up into the sky. It disappeared and didn't make a sound. I turned to look at my father, and he's still just looking all dreamily at the sunset. "Did you see that?" I asked. But he didn't know what I was talking about. He didn't see any of it. I didn't want to tell anyone because I was supposed to be perfect, and people in that town would have just thought I was crazy or on drugs. I haven't even thought of this memory until today. "Well, Mom," I said, "they were watching you." We changed the subject abruptly after that and didn't mention it again. It was uncomfortable talking to her about it. I expected to blow up in a fit of rage because that has been pretty much her reaction to everything my entire life. I didn't expect for her to say what she did. Looking back now, in context with what I've come to learn in the past few years, I'm guessing that the visitors have been with me since before I was born. I have referred to the following event in my mind just as I've titled it: the spectacular final visit. I still cannot fully process the event, and it is the largest reason I've come here to share my experiences. I am going to recount 2 events here, because they happened within days of each other. My next writing here will be the final, wherein I will share some of what I've learned, say what I've guessed about it all, and speculate a bit. For now though, I want to say that I'm glad to be nearly finished telling this. My son stayed at his mother's place. She was living in motels at the time, but that's another story completely, every other week. And I had become used to having a week alone. It was late spring of 2015, and I came home from work to see a spectacular thunderstorm in the sky. It was an amazing display, with lightning going in a spiderweb-like patterns in all directions, booming loudly, and there were drafts of both cold and warm air moving along the ground, though it wasn't raining. I stood there just watching it and noticed an airplane flying by. Who the hell would fly a plane in this weather? I thought. I was tempted to dismiss it and look in another direction, but something seemed strange about the airplane. It was a single-engine craft with a propeller in the front, but it wasn't 3D. It was flat, like a painting, and the propeller didn't move. I kept studying it, noticing that it wasn't really flying at all. It was moving, but not flying. It moved very slowly, and as I looked more, I noticed that the flat image was superimposed atop something else. Barely visible behind the plane was a diamond-shaped thing, bending the light in a way that one might compare to the fictional movie Predator, and how his armor makes him only slightly visible. Its shape wasn't the diamond shape that people often use to describe things. It was like a side view of a cut diamond. Think of the symbol on Superman's chest, just the outline of it. That was the shape of this craft. I stared at it until it moved out of view to the north. By this time, I had seen so many weird things that I wasn't too shocked by it. I just went about my day and night, and things were fairly normal. They were normal until the final visit. I came home from work again later that week to an empty apartment. I just stood there in my living room at first, thinking about what I would do that night. I wandered into my bedroom, still lost in thought, and as I stared blankly at the back wall of my room, I noticed something like a white mist out of the corner of my eye near the ceiling. As I looked toward it, it moved away and behind me. Great, I thought. Now my eyes are going bad. I shuffled about and changed my clothes, and then wandered into the living room, still thinking to myself. I'm standing there with my back to the front door, looking toward my kitchen, and it comes out right in front of me. Moving about 4 feet from the ground, out from my bedroom door and across the area between my living room and kitchen, I see a mildly glowing mist that looked a lot like a cloud of smoke that wouldn't dissipate. It was nearly 2 feet long and a foot high, and resembled a drag from a cigarette, but it was mildly illuminated and never lost form. It just floated along directly in front of me, moving from my bedroom to my son's empty and darkened bedroom. I watch it move, and I'm completely stunned. I didn't have a clue to what to do, so I just stand there. Then I hear something fall over in my son's room. Something's in there moving around, knocking things over like a clumsy oaf. I call out to the room from where I stood. This is why people are scared of you. You just can't go around hiding in the dark, knocking things over in people's houses, uninvited. It's scary. This thing, whatever it was, knocks over some toys near my son's nightstand, and I'm starting to think it is a bumbling idiot. I'm getting annoyed with it now, but I'm also scared. I go to the bedroom and look in through the door. The room was dark, but a little light came in from above and behind me, where my dining room light shone, and right there on the wall in front of me was a 9-foot-tall, man-shaped shadow. My shadow was on the ground due to the light source, but this thing was standing there. Its head was huge and bulbous, and it was just a big scary shadow. It didn't move when I moved. It moved when I didn't move. It wasn't my shadow. It was something else. At this point, I'm scared. I walked back to the same spot in my living room where I had stood and started talking toward the darkened bedroom. You see what I mean? A big shadow guy? Really? How am I not supposed to be scared? This is what I'm talking about. You guys can't just do this and expect people not to be frightened. I'm going to try and not be scared. You've got to come out of there. You come out of here and we can talk, or do the telepathy thing if you want. I'll try not to be scared, I promise. As I'm speaking the last sentence, an orange ball of light floats out of my son's bedroom, about the same distance from the floor. It looks like a little sun, about the size of a golf ball. It's only mildly glowing, like how the sun looks through the lens of a satellite. I watch it float over one of my couches, right past me and through the large glass patio doors behind me. It went through the vertical blinds as if they weren't even there. On the other side of the glass outside, I hear a loud thump and the sound of something scrambling down the stairs as if it's running for its life. I'm too stunned to move for about a second or two. Then I think, this is it. I'm finally going to see one of those little gray bastards while I'm completely awake. I rushed to the door and peeked outside, and trotting away from my stairs is a large, mostly gray, male calico cat. At this point, I don't really know if it's a cat or something else in disguise, and it was really large for a house cat. He's just trotting away casually, and I'm a little upset with it now. "Hey!" I yell at him. He looks over his shoulder at me as if he's completely unimpressed, and then just turns back and keeps walking away. I stand on my porch a lot, and knew all of the local cats. I'd seen all of them 100 times, and I didn't recognize that cat at all. So, after all of this, I did what most people do. I needed a drink, and so I went to the local pub and got smashed. That was the only way I was going to sleep that night after seeing everything that I had. That's everything, folks. There are a few details and experiences I've omitted, but they're unimportant. No one has ever heard all this before, so I thank you for reading. December 2013. I used to work about 30 miles away from where I live. One night, I had been stuck in heavy traffic coming home. I take Lasix, so after a while, I really had to go to the bathroom. I kept telling myself that I was almost home and tried to hold it until I got there. By the time I got to my exit, I knew I wasn't going to make it to my house, so I pulled up to an area where Fidelity Investments is located and found an area that was isolated. This area is heavily wooded with walking trails and a lot of game, but it is also in a very populated area. I pulled up a little side drive off one of the main roads. That little drive is about 100 feet long with only room for one car. It went up in elevation and had bushes on the right side facing the main road. On the left side, there was a guardrail and a view of the valley below. The area up there is huge and isolated, with several buildings that are all spaced out. The place is dark at night because there are intermittent streetlights up there. At night, it's pretty deserted too. A few cars go through that area, though, because it's a shortcut people use to go from Taylor Mill over to 3L Highway, where there are stores, restaurants, etc. When you're up there, you're above everything around this area. When I stopped, I got out of my car, waited a moment, and looked around to make sure there were no other cars. It was winter, so the bushes between where I was and the road below me didn't have many leaves on them. Because of that, you could see right through them. I was up on this little rise, about 20 or 30 feet above the drive, which was 4 lanes wide. To the left of me was a streetlight and more woods that went down another hill to the main road. I went to the back of my car and did what I had to do. When I finished, I stood up, and all at once, every hair on my body stood up. I knew I wasn't alone. I scanned the area in front of me and must have heard something behind me, because I turned around and there were 3 deer standing there, all huddled up together between my car and the guardrail. They weren't looking at me. They were looking across the road. I looked back over there, and that was when I saw a figure standing between the bushes in front of it and the tree line behind it. It was huge. I stand 5'5". Some of those bushes were about 6 feet tall, but they only came up to about the collarbone area on this thing. Due to the streetlight to the right of it, about 20 feet away, I was able to get a pretty clean outline of this thing. It had a large dog-shaped head and pointed ears. I couldn't make out its neck, but I could make out massive shoulders. That's when it growled at me. It was a deep vibration I could feel in my chest. My body just took over at that point. I have to explain this part of it to you. I worked security for years in California in the music business. As a woman, I have to really work out and train to defend myself. I kickboxed for 8 years and worked out every single day. I also trained dogs, mainly Anatolian Shepherds and German Shepherds. Sometimes I have to establish who is the alpha, and to do that, I get them down, hold them in place, grab them by their ear, and growl until they submit. Then the training can start. So, when this thing growled at me, it was just pure instinct. I dropped down to a crouching position and growled right back at it. When I did that, it stopped growling and started sniffing the air. Its snout went up and turned its head slightly as it was sniffing. It then took a few steps forward. I was still crouched down on all fours, moved forward, still growling at the thing. When I did that, it stopped. I stood up, kept staring right at it. I never broke eye contact with it. Then, it slowly stepped back into the tree line until I couldn't make it out as clearly as before and started to move to the right of me. The deer were still behind me. They were so close I could have reached out and touched them. I waved my arms and told them to get out of there. When I did that, they went back over the guardrail and took off down the hill. That's when I jumped in my car and got out of there as fast as I could. I felt this thing was trying to circle behind me, and I wasn't going to wait around for that. Do I think I scared it? No. But I do think I confused it for a couple of minutes, and that gave me some time to move. I had told my husband about what happened up there, but I didn't tell him exactly what I saw. He would think I was nuts, and to be honest, I thought I was a little crazy myself until I saw a picture of a Dogman. I know there are other things in this world that can't be explained. I've seen them, but this was beyond any of those things. Since this happened, I can't take that shortcut through that area anymore. My husband took me back over that way once to see the area, and I was begging him to get me out of there the whole time. I thought I was going to throw up. The wildlife up there has almost totally disappeared. I never see anything up on the hills anymore. The street I live on is only about 1 mile or so down the hill from this place, and lately, we have seen coyotes on the streets, like they have been chased out, and pets here have started to go missing. We've also seen a large black figure moving through our backyards down here. The dogs throughout the neighborhood go crazy regularly now too. People were calling the cops when we saw that large black figure jumping fences. I'm concerned that it has come down the hill after eating everything up there. I should start off explaining that my partner and I are experienced Bigfoot investigators who are in a unique situation, as we have a family group living in our research area. Last October, during the full moon, my partner and I were on our hilltop having quite a bit of success with 2 juveniles and 1 adult that we noticed. We could hear them walking in the leaf litter, and every once in a while, we could also hear a clack or wood knock from different directions. After a while, it seemed the feeling of fun for them dissipated and became a lot more cautious. Mike heard something to our north and went a ways down to investigate, while I stayed by the camp, just to make sure it wasn't a diversion. He came back in a rush and said he had seen one of the young ones come out of the woodline, running for the other side of the firebreak, and what was following, he said, he couldn't comprehend. It was about 6 feet tall, with pointy ears and a long snout. At this point, I have to say that neither of us have really given any creed to the whole Dogman, Wolfman, Grassman theory. We just thought it was a mistaken identification of a Bigfoot or a bear. I had purchased a .40 caliber handgun and some hydroshock ammunition for it earlier that day, so it was in my vehicle. After Mike had explained what he had seen, I retrieved my weapon and loaded it. All the while, we could hear the 2 young ones chattering and the big one stomping all to our backside. They were pissed or upset about something, and they never acted that way with us. I had Mike take me down the firebreak to where he saw this creature, and with spotlights, we scanned the area. We could hear something moving around and a few short growls. Finally, Mike caught it with the spotlight, going between trees, and what I witnessed is something I would never have dreamed of seeing, except on a movie screen. A 6-foot wolf, walking on its hind legs. I fired my weapon in the air, and it turned to the southeast into the woods. We cautiously made our way back to camp, but we could hear this thing pacing us to our left. As we got back to camp, we kept listening to this thing approaching us from the woods. Mike turned on the spotlight, and I leveled my gun wherever the sound was coming from. It was approaching us without fear, and it felt to both of us like it was stalking us, as it was one of our juvies that Mike had witnessed. It came out from between the trees, and I shot it square in the ribs at about 20 yards away. We measured the next day, and I am a very good shot. I saw the wound, and know without a doubt I hit it. It fell to the ground, but immediately got up and ran to the southeast. We could hear it crash through the brush, and we even heard it fall down or trip over something. But it continued to head in pretty much a southerly direction, down the hill, paralleling the firebreak. We were both freaked out by this time, and broke camp and left. The next morning, I loaded up a few extra clips, and we went back up to see if it died somewhere close, or was just wounded, so we felt we had to track it down. We did track it from the point where I shot it, all the way down the canyon, and even found where it made such a ruckus when it fell. The leaf litter was up all-ended, and was fairly easy to track. At one point, we did find a perfect canine track in the mud ridge, but it was over 8 inches across. The thing that absolutely baffled both of us was that there was no blood trail. None. We both saw the bullet hit, yet no blood? We tracked it all the way down the canyon until we lost the trail. We talked to a Native American couple we know, and they immediately said Skinwalker. We contacted a few other investigators to try and figure out what in the hell happened. I mentioned before that neither of us took any creed from any Dogman reportings, but I do know that neither of us wants to experience it again, and I have never gone out in the woods unarmed since that day. I don't know if you remember me. It's been months since I've written to you. A while back, I had traveled into the Arkansas Ozarks and found that dead black bear that was ripped to shreds. I'm sure you get a lot of stories sent to you, so hopefully you might remember mine. I might just have to try and dig up your episode with my story in it, but I digress. A few months ago, before all the quarantine craziness, I had traveled back into the Ozarks and was hiking around. I was actually searching for good streams to fish out of, and I was around the Richland Creek area, to be exact. I know there are bear in the area, and that's about the only large big animal that I'm familiar with. The area and terrain that I was in is very rocky, and I remember walking along the edge of the creek, looking down into the very soft gravel. I noticed tiny indents. Well, not tiny, but tiny as in large footprint, but with a very light indentation because of the gravel. My eyes followed it about 10 feet, and then right there, on the very edge of the creek, were some of the largest wolf tracks I've ever seen. Of course, the one time I don't bring my camera with me, I see something like this. The only thing I can personally compare them to is my own hand. It was easily double the size of my hand. Absolutely massive. It was without a doubt a canine track. I mean, canine prints are pretty distinctive, and they are hard to mistake. Normally, I would just suggest somebody had their dog out here, but I don't believe dogs get this big, of any breed. If I had to measure with my eyes, I would say in total it was maybe 14 and 15 inches in length, or from corner to corner, I guess. Anyway, just thought I would share that with you. This was back in February, when things were still very wet. I was visiting some friends down in Huntington, Arkansas, back in '91 for the summer. We decided to go to this neat little lake that was great for bass fishing. One thing you got to be careful about down there is water moccasins everywhere, and they will bite. So there I am, trudging along the bank of the lake, trying to watch every single step very carefully. That's when I started hearing commotion off to my left, when I turned my head and saw one of the largest creatures in my life staring at me, watching me. I've never been so afraid in my life. This thing looks like it came from the pits of hell. It was tall, standing on 2 feet, covered in dark black hair that almost looked to absorb light itself. It was so jet black. The eyes felt like they put me in a trance. These glowing red-orange orbs, or amber I guess you would call it. I've never felt such hate and malice off a being before. As soon as we locked eyes, I just felt that this thing was bad news, and if I stuck around, it was really going to hurt me. I knew not to run because I didn't know what this thing was. If it was a predator, I would only incite the chase if I ran. So I tried to back away slowly, which I did until it was entirely out of sight. It never followed me, just continued to watch me even as I moved away. As I backed further and further out, this thing kept its focus on the lake as it was intently watching something in the water. I don't know what. When I made it back to my friends, they laughed at me, asking me why I was so pale and shaking. I knew in that moment if I told them what I'd seen, I'd be the laughing stock of the group for the day. So I just said I saw a big moccasin and nearly avoided it. I'm no horror movie fan, but sometimes when I've watched werewolf movies before, it really gives me the creeps because they always remind me so much of what I saw that day. Not saying it was a werewolf, just that this thing and those things from the movies looked very similar. I believe what I saw was definitely more than an animal. When it and I locked eyes, I could tell there was intelligence in this being I was staring at, and it wasn't just a wild animal. It felt evil, but still very intelligent, if that makes any sense. Are ghosts real? That's a question that so many people have. Some are believers, and others are skeptical. Let me give you a story on why I'm a believer. I have always been able to see ghosts, even when I was a very young child. But back in 2009, I was about 14 years old, growing up in Little Havana, down in Miami. My mother was a constant churchgoer, but I haven't stepped foot in a church in over 5 years at this point. One Sunday night, my mother had invited me to go to church with her, and I decided to agree and go with her. 6 p.m. comes along, and we were all dressed and ready to go once we arrive. It feels as if all bad and negative energy was all left outside the door. Things are going great, and it was getting towards the end of the evening, and we all get down on our knees and pray. I close my eyes, and all of a sudden, it's as if I have left my body and started floating above everyone, including myself. I'm at a loss for words. All of a sudden, I see someone else floating, but this person had wings and a beautiful glow around them, just as if I was seeing my guardian angel. At this moment, I'm lost in thought, but felt at ease. I see this angel start to move over to where I'm kneeling, and starts to get in the same kneeling position, and he slowly starts to hover downward, and it looked as if this angel was going inside my body. But the only thing that looked was left out were the angel wings, and they now looked like they were attached to me. After that, I snapped back and my prayer is over. I got up and felt so great and peaceful. I've never felt better in my entire life. We arrive at home, and I decide to go to my room and watch some TV, and my room was pretty spacious and very long, so I lay down on my futon in front of my bed with a blanket and have the lights off and start watching George Lopez. Midnight comes along, and I was very relaxed and enjoying watching my show. A couple minutes later, after midnight, I start to feel that it's getting harder to breathe. The air started to feel very dense. I heard a thump on my bedroom door. I immediately looked over and saw nothing, so I turned back to the corner where my TV was at, and now I'm frightened and in total shock now. I'm seeing about 6 to 8 dark shadows walking in my room, itching closer and closer to me, and they just stare at me with very blank expressions. I was in too much shock and so frightened that I couldn't move from the spot I was sitting in, and I looked down to my blanket to try and not to look at them. But now, I start to see roaches crawling on me. I try and push them off as I'm yelling, "Get off me!" in tears at this point, because I didn't know what to do, but they just kept coming, and coming, and coming. I threw the blanket off me and got up. All of a sudden, I start getting this stench in the room. I can't exactly pinpoint what it smelled like, but the closest thing I can think of is the smell of burnt rats that have been left to rot for years. As soon as I get this horrible smell, I get this horrible feeling, and the hairs in the back of my neck start to stand, and I could feel somebody looking at me behind me as I was so petrified to want to turn around. I slowly turn towards where my bed is, and to this day, I still can't get the image out of my head. I saw this demonic-looking figure standing about 6'9" tall, with the torso of a man who's heavily built, but the lower half looked like goat's feet. Its hands looked as though they were claws from a bear. Its face wasn't very hard to distinguish. It was dark in my room, and you could see this demonic shadow. Its eyes were blacker than the rest of its face, with sharp teeth, and it seemed to have horns on its head. I was frozen in fear, and this figure made such a horrible growl and started to reach with its claw for my head. I quickly ran back and turned on the light. Just like that, it was gone in a flash. I go to my mother in tears, explaining what I just saw. She wasn't sure if it was just my imagination and my mind playing tricks on me or what. I told her I screamed for her to come in and said no sounds had come from my room. The next day comes along, and I try to put it in my head that it was just my mind getting the better of me. So, come nighttime, I decided to go to sleep early because the previous night I was up most of the night anyway. I slept with my face to the wall. Around 10:30 p.m., I start to hear my door being opened and then closing. The weird part is, I maintained my room locked after what happened the previous night. I start to hear and feel footsteps getting closer to me, and closer to where I feel somebody looking over me, and I could feel breathing on my neck as my neck cringes tighter and tighter, as if somebody is choking me. I close my eyes, and when I do, I start to get a vision of this creepy figure on top of me with a sinister smile on its face. I was so scared of what was going on. I was not able to move or open my eyes after that. It felt as if I was paralyzed from head to toe. I don't know how long someone or something was staring at me, but it felt like forever. Eventually, I feel it get off me, and footsteps start to move towards my bedroom door to leave. I hear the door open and then close. Once it closes, I feel like I can breathe again, and I'm able to move. My heart is racing, I'm sweating like no other, and decided to turn on the light. I didn't sleep at all that next night again. The next morning, I go to say good morning to my mother and ask if she happened to walk into my room or hear anything last night, and she replied with a simple and concerned no, and I told her what had happened. That same day, we decided to go back to church, and I talked to the priest and tell him of what I have seen and gone through the last few days, so he decided to do a prayer just for me. I still felt very edgy on everything, but hoped that the prayer would help. Come nighttime, I start watching TV in the dark, and I hear a noise behind me. I look over and this demonic creature is right behind me, a lot closer than before. It looked a lot angrier now, and more aggressive towards me. It lunged for me again, and I quickly jumped open my bedroom door and ran to my mother's room in terror. She quickly turns on her lights and tries to calm me down, but nothing was working. We decide to go to church again and tell the priest that it is still happening now. The church is more concerned, and they decided to do a type of ritual. Not exactly an exorcism, but something to try and get rid of the demonic spirit that keeps terrorizing me. They sit me down on a chair and pour some holy water on my hands and have me hold onto this bamboo stick of some sort, while everyone from the church builds a circle around me with 3 candles sat around. So, we commence, and they start walking in a circle, while the priest is saying a prayer, and others praying for me. I could feel anger start to build inside of me, to the point I wanted to yell at every one of them and beat everyone with a steel chair. I was sitting in it, including my own mother. I started to feel the pain of my life, the torture I have been through. I started to feel hell inside of me. My mind started envisioning everyone down on the ground, bloodied, and me over them with a huge grin on my face. I feel power. I felt total evil running through my veins. It almost felt like I wasn't in control of myself anymore. I felt my head spinning and spinning. I could almost feel my body getting lighter with every passing second. I felt like I was going to explode. Once it was over, I suddenly snapped back into reality, and everyone looked at me and started asking how I was feeling, and I just said very tired and drained. People started shaking my hand and hoping this would help, but many were still worried when they realized my hands were freezing cold, more than usual. It's Florida, and anyone who has lived here knows how humid it is here all the time, so to get much of a chill around here isn't often. But on this day, my hands felt as if they were on fire, but everyone else said my hands were cold. I decided to take the temperature of my hands real quick to figure out which it is, and to my surprise, my hands were actually 25 degrees below room temp, while the rest of my body was at a normal temp, which is around 98 degrees, so for my hands to be that freezing in a matter of minutes, it was very shocking. I was very quiet on the ride home and told my mother I was tired and wanted to go to bed, and she just said, "Okay, good night, I love you." So I head back to my room, feeling tired, had the TV on for some night in my room, and went to lay down for about 15 minutes later. I hear a growl and looked, and I saw this demonic creature again. At this point, I have had enough. I decided to stand up, turn off the TV, and have the room pitch black. I could see this creature still as he is right in front of me. Now I grabbed my Bible and start yelling at it, saying, "I'm not afraid of you. You aren't nothing without my fear. I have God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit with me, and my guardian angel has been protecting me from the start, and now I'm ready to stand up. Go away, you don't belong here." I yelled. I finished by saying, "In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, I now banish you." As I go to reach for the light, I hear one last powerful growl, and I can now feel my room feeling less heavy. I feel at peace. I stayed up all night thinking. Come morning, I go out to the kitchen to where my mother's cooking breakfast. I asked her if she had heard any commotion from my room or me yelling, and she said she couldn't hear a peep out of me or my room, and it was just total silence. I told her how I yelled a prayer at this demonic creature, which, to this day, I still believe I faced the devil and made him leave. I still continue to have paranormal experiences from time to time, but haven't seen this level of demonic activity. I decided to move across the country and move to Arizona, looking for a fresh start, leaving all of this paranormal stuff behind me. Things are going great until just recently, things have taken another turn for the worst. July 1st, 2014. I was on patrol as a deputy sheriff for the county and was usually assigned to the Highway 13 and Highway 30 corridors. However, I recall that particular July 1st, that a young man, 16 or 17 years old, had been sucked into a storm drain, which emptied into Cedar Lake near the Quaker Oats plant. This is a place with heavy foot traffic and located in an urban setting. The area is also bordered by Mohawk Park. As the search went on into the night, the local PD got the county involved. I parked my cruiser at what I believe was the electric company's storage yard. The yard had what I estimated to be a 10-foot fence that ran parallel to a paved bike trail on the other side, which runs a large concrete spillway to siphon off floodwaters. I arrived at what I estimate to be roughly 11:30 p.m. to approximately 11:45 p.m. I estimate only because I assure you there never was, nor will be, an official statement or record with my name on it telling this story. As I left the lot, I was at the north end of the lake and headed west on foot. There was a lot of brush and saplings between the spillway and the trail, so I proceeded onto the point of the trail that turns south near where Cedar Lake empties into the Cedar River. This is all under the railroad tracks leading into the Quaker Oats. There are multiple tracks at the turn I mentioned before, and the only track furthest from myself had a train on it. With my attention on the spillway, I hardly noticed at first a faint red-colored light a distance north from my position. It was coming down the track on the other side of the train. I thought it perhaps the trail lights of a car. Not being that patrol route, I had no knowledge that there was, in fact, no road in that direction. There ain't much things in the world that scare me. Put simply, I've seen some things in my days. But nothing prepared me for that night. The lights disappeared, and that was that. Or so I figured. About 5 minutes pass before I hear a snorting, almost sniffing sound coming from the other side of the tracks. When I turned, the first thing I saw were the eyes. They glowed a dull red. The thing was at least 8 foot tall, pushing 450. I judge this by the fact that I am 6'4" and weigh 280 pounds. I turned my light, and to this day, I wish I hadn't. It had pointed ears and a long muzzle, and it looked me right in the face before it bolted into the timber. It was not a mask, and it was not a person in a costume. Who would walk up on an armed man with a police radio in full uniform and risk getting shot? I remember it was so surreal, so final, I guess. I know it's in the dark now. People can say or think what they want, but even with a chambered round and a full magazine in a Glock 40, didn't feel like enough firepower. I unholstered and fell back toward the trail and to the electric company's storage yard. Putting the fence to my back, I made a hasty retreat to a lot with my cruiser. I don't think I holstered my pistol till I got out of the park. I never spoke of it then, and honestly don't know why I am now, but one thing is for certain. It knew I was there, and it was watching my every move. I'll never go back, and I no longer work with the department since becoming a minister. But I still carry a Glock with hollow point rounds tipped with silver if, and I rarely do, leave my home at night. August was 17 years old at the time. My dad and mom had taken my little brother and sister to Tucson to do something for the day. We lived in a trailer in a rural area outside of Sierra Vista. We had 2 horses, 2 dogs, a cow, and some chickens on the small amount of land we had. As the eldest son, it was my job to feed and take care of them. On the night in question, it was a stormy monsoon rain with thunder and lightning going on. But like monsoons can be, they rage and then settle into the lull and rage again. I was getting ready to settle down and watch a good movie when all of a sudden, my 2 dogs start barking and wouldn't shut up. When I told them to calm down, in fact. In the previous week or so before, my dogs had been acting up and barking a lot at night. I just attributed this to coyotes that I'd heard howling in the night. So I got my dad's rifle and just 1 bullet, in case I had to shoot to scare off the coyote or kill it if rabid. I rested the loaded rifle near the wall by the back door and turned on the floodlights outside the trailer. The rain had just stopped, so I looked out by the window near the front door and saw our 2 horses and cow staring as if through the front door to the back door of the trailer where the dogs were barking. I thought, maybe they're scared of the coyotes. So I grabbed the rifle and opened up the back door. As I was getting near the back door, I heard my dogs whimpering and crying. Now I was thinking, could it be a pack of coyotes? So I put a few bullets in my pocket, figuring I could load them if I didn't like what I saw. I opened the door, and the darndest thing happened. My 2 dogs beeline rushed past me to the center of the trailer and hunkered down, right in the kitchen. Mud is everywhere on the floor, from their paws, and I'm pissed because I have to clean it up now. So I close the door and go to try to get my dogs to get out, but they wouldn't budge and squirmed out of my arms when I tried to grab them. They were terrified. Now I was mad at the Coyotes and grabbed the rifle to go run them off or kill them. The trailer sits on a foundation of blocks. The front and back doors are accessible by a small set of small stairs. I'm 5'6", by the way. I opened the back door and was looking out in the darkness. At that point, I was about to step out when I saw a set of eyes looking back at me out of the darkness. From the top of my head in the trailer to the ground is around 7+ feet or so, and here is a set of eyes looking at me, level and square on. I'm like, darn, Coyote must be on a small gravel hill. We used to pave the road, or it's a bird on a mesquite bush. But I was thinking to myself, what monsoon was awfully bad and rained hard? What kind of bird would hunker down on a mesquite bush? And why would a coyote be out in a downpour? So I'm raising my rifle and drawing a bead on the eyes when lightning lights up the night. All of a sudden, the lightning illuminates a small gravel hill that's like 6 feet high and the surrounding mesquite bushes. The light winks out as fast as it appeared from the lightning though. There was nothing on the gravel hill and no bird on any of the mesquite bushes. Then it dawned on me. Whatever it was very tall and was still staring at me. A sense of dread crept over me all of a sudden, as I realized that the rifle had only one measly bullet, and if I missed, there was no way I'd be able to reload in time before this thing, whatever it was on me. I kept the gun pointed at it as I quickly closed the door. I locked the door, realizing this trailer would never withstand whatever it was that was out there if it attacked. I locked the front door and turned on all of the lights in the house. I grabbed all the bullets, the 30-06 and the .22 rifle, and then got in the kitchen with the dogs and I loaded each rifle full on. I hugged my dogs and prayed that whatever it was went away and didn't attack. I stayed awake that whole night until my parents got back. My dad was furious that all the lights were on. My dad checked outside though for coyotes, but whatever it was gone. Some say skinwalker, but I think otherwise. I was only 19 when this happened to me. It was back in the early fall of 1981, when I was spending a lot of my time working. When I was 19, I lived outside of Fayetteville, not too far, about 30 or so miles away in a small town known to many as Siloam Springs. Because of the job I worked at, it would require me to pull later shifts since I would usually be covering more than just my job. I had a good-for-nothing boss at the time who insisted that it saved the company more money by throwing their employees with bigger tasks and workloads, but no overtime pay. But that's a story for another day. One evening, I was driving back home outside of Fayetteville along Highway 68. I'm probably on the road for no more than a couple of minutes before my eyes catch something. This tall figure walking alongside the road about 50 feet away from the car. As I pull closer to it, I can see that this looked to be someone in an elaborate Werewolf in London costume from way back. Why would they be wandering the side of the road out here? I thought the whole thing was strange, but then I got closer, and what I thought to be a person actually turned its head. I realized in that moment, it wasn't just somebody having a convincing werewolf costume party. If there was ever a living werewolf, this was it. I just remember how scary its face looked. I think my headlights caught its attention, because as it turned around, it also lifted up its arm, as if to shield its eyes from the light. After standing there for a second, it quickly vanished off the road on the same side it was on. Freaked me the hell out. I had seen enough to know that it was not a person. A person doesn't act like that in a costume, or move like that. I could tell even in the poor lighting, its fur had to be thick. It was long and stringly. Think of a long-haired fluffy dog, I guess. I'm not sure how to explain it. It had a longer snout, but the upper part of its face is what I think was more fierce looking. It just had an angry expression. You know how dogs can look when they're happy, or even when they're mad? It was the same kind of thing. It just seemed to have a scowl on its face. I saw it for what felt like an eternity, but it did raise up its arm fairly quickly to shield its eyes from my headlights. When I had seen it, I came down almost to a stop to cruise and to try to figure out what it was I was looking at. Never in all my years have I ever seen such a thing. I know about Bigfoots, but I don't know what it is I encountered that night. Back in the early 80s, I had went fishing with a couple of buddies out in a lake that was adjacent to the Mississippi River. I believe the year was either 84 or 85. This was also near the town of Hughes, not far off from Highway 147. The lay of the land is thick with brush and forest, intermixed with cypress and pine. It's a beautiful wetland area. We were exploring the area and hiking around along the lakes and areas near the large river. It was nearing sundown, and we still had a ways to go to get back to where we had come from. We all heard this loud crashing sound near the bank of the river in the thick foliage and undergrowth. We weren't sure if it could have possibly been a stray cow or maybe another fisherman perhaps. All of a sudden, we see this thing that was shaped like a person appear out of the foliage just feet from the edge of the water. It looked just like a dog standing up on two legs. It had thick matted hair, and its head was disproportionately large. I still remember those large pointed ears. I don't know why, how, who, or what, but by the grace of God Almighty, it didn't notice us, somehow. After maybe a second of appearing out of the foliage, it lifted its head up in the air and sniffed around just like how a dog does. Then it looked off in the opposite direction we were and jumped full body into the river. All three of us were shocked but amazed by what we had just seen. My one friend kept trying to tell me it was just a bear, but it was definitely canine looking, no doubt about that. From the distance we were at too, I would say it was at least as tall as we were. It even had a thin, tapered waist like a dog, and dog-like legs. It was eerie. I don't think there's any native wild dogs that walk upright in this area, but I guess I'm wrong. I know I've heard people talk about strange things that happen near the river and in the woods, but I always just thought it was more hoaxes and BSing. Anyway, the entirety of the encounter lasted maybe 20 seconds in total. I feel like that's being pretty gracious. Maybe more like 10 to 15 seconds. I should state that we didn't smell anything unusual in that moment, or before or after the incident. Never got any weird feelings, experienced anything weird or anything unusual. It was just when we heard that crashing sound that we saw this thing. We were about 100 plus feet away from it, but where it was at, we had a clear as day view of this thing. Even in dusk, there was enough light to make out vivid details. Hello there. My name is Bradley, and I am somewhat of an adrenaline junkie. What I do to get this fix, if adrenaline, is I would go out in search of nothing in particular and just hope something happens. Sometimes I get more than I wanted, and this is one of those stories, with the exception that I wasn't seeking adrenaline this time. Be warned that some events in this story may be disturbing for the faint of heart. This is your warning. Continue at your own risk. The date is October 14th, 2010. I used to live on a decent-sized property in the mountains of northwestern Georgia. I loved it up there. So many places to wander off to, and so many places have a little hideout. It was the day before my uncle's birthday, and me and him wanted to go out to our favorite hangout spot, which we called the broccoli tree. In a nutshell, it was an uprooted tree with a hole big enough to fit a couple of chairs and some other things where the roots had been. We did some modifications and put a tarp over it so we could stay in there even if it rained. So, me and my uncle are walking out to the tree, which is about a good 15-minute walk from the front porch of the house. As soon as we break into the tree line, we start messing around and pushing each other playfully, without a care in the world. My uncle and I had walked to the tree so many times we can find it in the pitch black darkness, so we weren't really that afraid. I sort of had this feeling that we were being watched, but I just shrugged it off a little and kept walking. Skip forward a little bit to our arrival at the tree. Nothing seemed out of place, so we went inside and sat down. We started to talk about specific things, what he had seen out hunting, and things like that. Then, he mentioned a skinwalker. Confused, I asked him what it was, and he broke it down so I could understand. He said that they were half man, half beast that could shapeshift. I laughed at this and asked him if he'd been playing too much Diablo recently, not thinking he was serious. He looked me in the eyes with dead, serious looks on his face and says he saw one while he was hunting. My excitement immediately turned to fear as I remembered that I felt something was watching us on the way to the tree. I told him I had a feeling we were being watched, and he said that he had felt it too. We start listening closely to see if we could hear anything outside the tree, but everything felt silent. We both looked at each other and decided we had to leave. We emerged from the tree, and he tells me to jump onto his back so he could run. I do so, and the moment I was on his back, he had a tight grip. We heard something from behind us. I go to turn around and look to see what it was, but my uncle told me not to. Then he started running to the house in almost pitch black darkness with something chasing after us. I could hear its footfalls behind us, and heavy breathing was getting louder as if it was getting closer. I scream faster at my uncle, and he starts dead-ass sprinting through the woods. Then the front porch light comes into view through the trees, and I say, "There it is." Then my uncle trips over himself, and we both catch air. I was flung a little higher, so I landed closer to the house than he did. I looked back at him, and he screamed at me to run and to not worry about him. I didn't listen. I ran over to help him when something hit me square in the chest, knocking me back. "Don't look!" my uncle screamed. I wish I would have listened. I look up to see a man with a dog-like head and glowing, solid white eyes. My uncle tries to scurry away from it, but it grabs him and picks him up to his feet and stares into his eyes. Then came a gunshot. The beast tosses my uncle into a tree and scurries away, frightened. That's when my other uncle comes up from behind me and helps my uncle up off the ground. I slowly stand up and wipe myself off, ask what that thing was. The uncle that was with me says only one word: Skinwalker. Then all three of us go back to the house. A couple of days later, the uncle that was with me was deployed overseas to Korea for the army. We tried to forget, but we just couldn't seem to get it off our minds. One night, I woke up at about 4 a.m. because of a dream I had had. I rubbed my eyes and let them adjust to the low levels of light and see the two glowing eyes again, right outside my window. I grabbed the flashlight I had in my room for late night bathroom runs and shine it right out the window. Within a few seconds, the skinwalker ran away, and I have yet to see him again. To this day, both of my uncles have not spoken a word about this and refuse to talk about it. Christian here. I had accepted Christ at an early age. Always felt like a hypocrite because life at home was less than pleasant. Seemed like locking horns with my mom was a weekly occurrence. Anyway, I was 12 years old when this happened. We lived in an extremely small house, and it was hot, humid summer day. Me and my mom had been arguing because I had asked earlier in the week for a picture of my grandmother. She passed right before I was born, and my mom locked away anything that reminded her of her mom. I did know my dad's family, as they lived in another state, and my mom was not a people person. She never allowed me to mingle with what few relatives I ever had. As a kid, everyone knew I had aunts, grandmas, grandpas, nieces, nephews. I had nada. So, anyway, I kept bugging my mother to produce a picture of my grandma, and she refused. So, one very hot day, I am in my bedroom in my house with one failing AC unit in the living room. I'm listening to records on my bed and begin to get really cold, starting to see my breath with this fog forms at the end of the bed. I'm thinking a fire? Fog? As clear as day, an elderly woman's face forms in the mist, and she smiles at me. Her features were so distinct they may have lasted 10 to 15 seconds, then all starts to fade. My trusty 70s Polaroid was probably on the nightstand, but I was frozen, where I sat in complete awe of the situation. A few minutes later, my mom came into the room and asked me, "How in the world did this room get so cold?" It definitely was not because of the tired old AC unit. Later on, I told her what had happened, and she finally caved in and retrieved a picture of her mom from around the time she had passed. It was the face in the mist at the end of my bed. Most pastors I have spoken to about this say it had to be a demon, as there is no spirit Starbucks hangout when you die. You are either with the Lord or with Satan. If it was something malevolent, then why the one-time appearance? Anyway, thought I would share. I'll start off by saying that I have never believed in any of these sort of creatures, but I saw something in early 2009 that really disturbed me and is making me change my mind. I was not under the influence of any drugs, and I have better than average eyesight, and the lighting was nearing sunset, but I was still able to see clearly. So I'll get this underway and explain my story, and maybe someone can shed some light on this for me. I live in Fergus Falls, Minnesota, which is in west central Minnesota, about an hour drive from Fargo, North Dakota. My mother-in-law lives out in the country, about 3 or 4 miles out of Fergus Falls, and I was staying there a while with my wife and her mother while they went shopping in town. They called me and asked if I wanted to go to a 7 p.m. movie. So I left the house at about 6:30, 6:45 to meet them at the theater. About 2 miles away from their house, on a country road known as Wendell Road, along the Mustinka River, I saw 3 white-tailed deer. 2 of the deer were rather small, probably just yearlings, and a larger doe, who I assumed was their mother. Me, being an avid hunter, lover of wildlife, and future wildlife biologist, stopped to look at the deer. I should also mention that I hunt in the area and have spent my whole life in the Fergus Falls area. The deer were following a small creek bed, which is in fact the Mustinka River, so there were hardly any trees, except for one. Maybe because I didn't see it there, but because of the tree, but I just noticed something crouching behind the tree on my side of the road, looking at the deer, and to my belief, hunting them. It just sat there, looking at the deer, taking no notice of me, even though I was in my truck, no more than 40 yards away, with a clear view, with nothing obstructing my view of it. It had one hand on the tree that it was bracing itself with. What struck me as shocking was the fact that it seemed to be a 2-legged creature and not a 4-legged one. Its hands appeared to have opposable thumbs and were rather slender and long, very unlike a wolf. The creature looked as though it had stood upright. It would be over 7 feet tall, with a protruding muzzle, broad shoulders, a slender waist, thick, muscular thighs, and being as there was snow on the ground, I couldn't see the feet. He was deep, dark brown in color throughout the body. After several seconds of looking at the creature in shock, the deer ran off. Then, something amazing happened. It looked right at me, as though blaming me for losing his meal. He just sat there, looking at me, and blinking, but not moving. This scared the crap out of me, so I hit the gas pedal and drove off. It was very dark after the movie, so I didn't feel much like trudging through the 3.5 feet of snow with the possibility of a monster lurking in the area who is currently looking for a meal that I scared off. So, at about 10 a.m., I went back there and walked down to the tree. Under the tree, there was no snow, so there were no tracks that I could see, but leading up to the tree, there were 3 tracks leading in from my grandmother-in-law's field, which was hard, black dirt. And if you know what a Minnesota field looks like in late winter, early spring, you can't make out anything of the dirt. The tracks I did find were only about 6 to 7 inches in length, but were clearly canine prints, with the exception of 4-toe-looking marks in the snow. This occurred in early December of 2011. At around 2 a.m. in the morning, a friend and I were sitting in my bedroom, hanging out whenever we both noticed something moving on my surveillance monitor. I had a camera pointed down my driveway so I could see whenever I had company drive up. When we both looked up, I saw what appeared to be a large canine running on all fours, and in mid-run, this thing came up on its hind legs and continued running across my field and across my driveway and into my brother's field on 2 legs. I was in shock, and my friend immediately turned to me with her mouth wide open. I asked her, "What did you just see?" And she replied with, "Well, what did you see?" I saw where this was going, so I then asked her, "How many legs was it running on?" She replied, "It was running on 4, but went to 2. I then had a cold chill run through my body as I knew she saw what I had seen. I jumped up and grabbed my night vision scope that I had recently purchased and ran to my front door with my friend behind me. I must admit, I was hesitant to open that door for fear of it maybe standing there, so I opened the door while letting out a roar as to maybe shock it if it was there, but it wasn't. Hey, I didn't know. I cautiously walked out on my front porch and took the scope and scanned the front field. There was nothing to be seen nor do I know which direction it went in, besides I had seen it last. I waited until daybreak and went out to where it crossed my driveway, and I found a paw print that was a good 12 by 12 inches. I was stunned. I just stood there looking back at the woods it had came from and looked south to where it was headed. I had no way to save the print and didn't think to take a picture at the time, nor was my camera recording at the time of the sighting either. From what I could see on the camera, this thing was massive in its upper body. I can still remember seeing the muscles flexing and the muscularity in its upper back as it came to its full height. It was running in weeds that came to my waist, but on all fours, it was a good 2 feet above them, and when it went to full height, I would estimate it to be a good 8 foot tall. Due to the camera showing only black and white, I didn't get to see its color, but I could tell you it was dark. Its head is something else that stands out, as I could see the snout and its pointed ears, which were laid back whenever it went to 2 legs. I am a research and development technician, so I am trained to watch for vivid details, and even though this thing was moving faster and faster than any human, I was transfixed on its form and what I was seeing. It was headed south into property that connects to the Stennis Space Center's buffer zone, which is over 100,000 acres of untouched and uninhabited acreage that was put aside for the space shuttle program in Hancock County since the mid-60s. So it is all the resources it needs in order to survive in those woods and to go undetected. I have always been an outdoors man, but since that sighting, I will not go out in the woods without a gun on me now. I know for a fact I do not want to run into that thing up close. I traveled all around Utah, maybe 11 months ago, and I've been really into the stories since then, but won't speak of them out loud. My fiance will speak of them out loud. He came inside tonight and tells me that he thinks he's seen a you-know-what, and and that we need to stop listening to those stories at nighttime. We heard the dogs bolt down the stairs, so he hops up to go outside. We've got a Rhodesian Ridge back that hops the fence at his leisure, and a blue heeler who alerts us to everything on the property, very vocally. Our 2 dogs run into, well, not two, but right into the fence and don't bark, which is incredibly unusual. The gait of the black figure was large and loud. It crossed an acre and a half in about half a second. It sounded wobbly, but like a human or a bipedal gait. It went diagonal across the wood-filled yard next to me, which you can see through the woods when they aren't thick. In other half a second, it was walking like a regular person and had made it up the length of the street and took a left at the 4-way. Once it turned there, it had a normal speed. My fiance came back inside with chills telling me this. It was just dark, not taking on odd shapes, but even in a well-lit spot, it's like the figure sucked in all the light around it. It didn't move like a human, and I've never seen my dogs or fiance act this way. None of them ever show fear. What could it have been? My family was on vacation in a town 5 hours away from my hometown in Kansas. We were staying with my uncle and his family. We went up there because my father is a gym rat, and he was supporting his friend in a bodybuilding competition. My dad drove up to his friend's hotel alone, without us, because they were going out to drink and go to clubs probably. We were also super tired and already getting ready for bed. I was half asleep when my father left, but it was just me, my older brother, and mother. Anyway, flashed forward like an hour or two. My dad had a little too much to drink and was drunk and unable to drive. My mom and uncle drove the 20-ish minutes across town to pick him up. They get to the bar and they get my dad in the car. My mom was kind of mad at this point. It was around midnight, and that's late for my mom. They get back on the road and heading to my uncle's house. My uncle was driving out of nowhere, and a large deer runs next to the car. My mom also said his head was on backwards. This is Kansas, and we have a lot of deer here because, well, there's a lot of woods around, but this was in a highway in a large city. Not to mention that deer was not in front of the car like a normal deer would be, but as though the deer was racing the car. My mom says the deer was staring into her window, into her eyes, and she said the deer looked like the devil was inside of it. She said he looked like he was angry, frustrated, and just fear and complete hate in his eyes. Also, the deer was like galloping like a house. My mom says it just seemed super off. She was freaking out and angry, and my uncle didn't see it, and my dad was drunk, and honestly, doesn't even know if he saw it. She got to my uncle's house, freaking the hell out, shaking, and couldn't believe what had happened. She couldn't sleep that night, obviously, because of what happened. Not until months later, maybe even a year later, I stumbled upon skinwalkers and what they are. It terrified me, and then I realized my mom had an experience with a skinwalker. I told my mom, and she got goosebumps. She knew what they were, but I connected the dots when I brought up the deer. This was a few nights ago, and I can't stop thinking about it. I just brought it up and she shivered, and the experience makes her even scared to think about. My dad is very skeptical and doesn't believe her, but I, on the other hand, 100% do.